Chapter 1. The Arrival at Willowbrook. Willowbrook was a village of quiet charm, the kind of place where the hedgerows grew thick and neat, the church spire pierced the sky with gentle pride, and the lanes wound like soft ribbons between cottages with thatched roofs. On a morning such as this, with sunlight streaming through the misty air, one could easily convince themselves that nothing in the world could go wrong. Yet, as Miss Marple herself had learned over many years, calm surfaces often hid the most turbulent currents beneath. The day began, as many days did, with the ordinary rhythm of the village. Postmen delivered letters with the careful precision of someone who feared disturbing even the faintest sense of peace. Children ran along the cobblestone lanes, their laughter punctuated by the soft bleating of a passing lamb. At the Rosehill tea rooms, Mrs. Finch fussed over a tray of steaming scones, while Mrs. Pennington, a woman whose curiosity exceeded even the morning sun in intensity, whispered to anyone within earshot about the latest news. Or, rather, her version of it. Into this gentle tableau arrived the first hint of disruption, the carriage from the Silent Manor. Willowbrook had, for generations, regarded the manor with a mixture of reverence and unease. Its gates were seldom opened, its windows shuttered against the world, and yet the villagers never quite stopped wondering about the lives inside. Today, however, the manor had produced more than curiosity. A young footman leapt from the carriage, flustered and red-faced. Behind him, the carriage's doors closed with a dull thud. He carried a small, intricately carved box, bound with ribbons and bearing a seal that seemed to hum with importance. "Another delivery from London," the man announced, his voice tinged with panic. "For the heir. They said it must not be opened until the proper time." Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner of the tea-room, her knitting forgotten on her lap, observed the exchange with the kind of interest a sparrow might display toward a sudden movement on the lawn. She noted the strain in the footman's shoulders, the slight tremble in his hands, the hurried way he had avoided looking directly at the patrons. People often revealed themselves not by what they said, but by what they tried desperately to hide. "Curious, isn't it?" she murmured to herself, though not so quietly that Mrs. Pennington failed to catch it. "A box that must not be opened, and yet it travels in daylight, in full view of the village." Mrs. Pennington gasped, clutching her pearls. "Oh, Miss Marple! Surely something mysterious." Chapter 2. Shadows and Secrets. The scream had not been repeated, yet its echo lingered in Willowbrook long after the wind had carried it away. Windows remained open as villagers whispered behind hands and curtains, their imaginations filling in the blanks. By the time Miss Marple reached the gates of Silent Manor, the heir was pacing in the grand entrance hall, the box from London now lying unopened on the oak table like a sleeping threat. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in the details immediately. The subtle indentations in the polished floor where someone's boots had slipped, the dust displaced on the heavy carpet, even the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering faintly despite the manor's supposed isolation. Every small observation was a key, and she collected them in her mind quietly, patiently, as she always did. "Come in, Miss Marple," the heir said, his voice trembling. I don't know what to make of it. It was the scream. It came from the library." He hesitated. "But when I went to check, nothing seemed wrong. The box was untouched. And yet," he trailed off, the implication heavy in the air. Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm. "Very well. Let us begin at the beginning. Tell me everything, as exactly as you can remember. I find that inaccuracy is rarely intentional, but it is always telling." He swallowed, steadying himself. "I was alone in the hall, preparing to examine the box, when I heard it, a sharp, sudden cry, almost a child's scream, yet distorted. I ran toward the library, thinking perhaps one of the servants had fallen or frightened herself, but there was nothing. The room was in order. The fireplace cold, the curtains drawn, the desk untouched, nothing that would explain it. And then, the box itself, well, it seemed, somehow, different." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the box. Its dark wood gleamed with an almost imperceptible sheen, the ribbons holding it in place taut and precise, as if the object itself demanded respect. She had seen many curious artifacts in her life, and some carried an aura not of magic, but of intent, as though the object's significance had been carefully cultivated over decades. "Different, you say?" she inquired softly. "In what manner?" He hesitated, then shook his head. It felt as if it had shifted. The seal, slightly loosened, though nothing else had moved. And I swear, I heard a whisper. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, though I cannot say any words were formed. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. She had long ago learned that whispers of the unseen were often echoes of what the mind expected to hear. Yet she made no comment. Observation, she knew, should not rush to judgment. "Very well," she said, moving closer to examine the box. She knelt, running a careful finger along its edges, noting the grooves, the texture of the ribbons, the faintest scratches in the varnish. "Tell me, has anyone else been near this since it arrived?" The heir shook his head emphatically. "Only myself and the footman who delivered it." He swore on his life he had touched nothing else. "Good," Miss Marple murmured. "And the manor has no other unusual visitors?" "No," he replied. "The house has been empty, save for the servants and myself, for the past week. It is quiet, too quiet." The calmness of the room seemed to contrast sharply with the storm of worry behind the heir's eyes. Miss Marple's mind moved like a quiet clock, ticking steadily, noting inconsistencies, imagining possibilities. "Show me the library," she said at last. "A scream leaves echoes, but echoes may mislead. I wish to see where it came from." They walked together down the long, narrow corridor, lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed to peer down at them with a faint disapproval. The heir paused, clearly unsettled. "I cannot explain it, Miss Marple." It was as if something unseen had passed through the room. And yet, no doors were open, no windows moved. Miss Marple stepped inside. The library was large, the shelves filled with leather-bound volumes whose spines gleamed in the dim evening light. A cold draught whispered through the room, brushing the edges of the curtains. On the floor, the carpet was pristine, save for a faint disturbance near the fireplace, a single indentation, barely visible, as though a small object had been shifted and replaced. She crouched, examining it. "Curious," she murmured. "This mark, it is fresh, but not heavy. Something light, perhaps, fell, then was placed back carefully. Nothing more." The heir looked puzzled. "But that doesn't explain the scream." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "But we must remember, not all screams are caused by the obvious. Some are echoes of fear, anticipation, or expectation. Did you notice anything unusual in the air? Any scent, any feeling that seemed off?" He considered. "Yes. A faint smell of lavender, though no one here uses it. And a chill, as though the room had grown colder for a moment." Miss Marple nodded. Lavender was often used in sachets to mask other odors, sometimes to conceal evidence. And a sudden chill could easily be a draught, yet in her experience, timing is never accidental. They left the library, walking back to the main hall. The box seemed to pulse subtly with importance, as if aware of the attention it commanded. Miss Marple inspected it again, turning it gently in her hands. There was nothing to indicate it had been opened, yet she made a mental note of the ribbons, the varnish, the weight, the faint warmth of the wood. Each detail mattered, be why the time evening fell over Willowbrook. News had begun to filter through the village. Mrs. Pennington and Mrs. Finch had already begun speculating. Some whispered about ghosts, some about thieves, and others about family curses. Miss Marple, ever patient, took careful mental notes. Gossip often concealed as much truth as it obscured, and in these tiny fragments lay the pieces of the puzzle she would one day assemble. Dinner was served quietly in the manor's dining hall, but the air was tense. The heir could not eat, his appetite suppressed by nerves. The servants moved cautiously, aware that something unseen lingered, watching them as well. Miss Marple observed all of it, noting subtle glances, hesitant gestures, and the occasional tremor of a hand. The smallest detail could reveal the greatest secret. Later, when the household had gone to bed, Miss Marple remained in the sitting-room. The box sat across from her on the low table, silently demanding attention. She considered its journey from London, the care with which it had been delivered, and the immediate stir it had caused. "Something is hidden within," she murmured to herself. "Not only in the object, but in the manner of its arrival, the fear it inspires, and the reactions of those around it. And if the village senses only part of the truth, well, it is my task to find the rest." The candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of the day's earlier scream. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. A quiet village, a mysterious box, and a frightened heir. Nothing more is needed to start a story that will unravel far beyond this room. And so, Willowbrook settled for the night, its streets empty, its windows dark. Yet within Silent Manor, anticipation hung as thick as the mist. And Miss Marple, quietly confident, prepared to follow the first fragile threads that would lead her into a web of secrets, betrayals, and truths hidden beneath polite smiles. Commanded attention, though the young heir tried to ignore it. He had been raised with instructions of propriety and patience, but the air of secrecy surrounding this small, delicate container made patience a cruel companion. And so the stage was quietly set. In Willowbrook, the rhythms of daily life continued, unaware of the tension rippling beneath. Miss Marple, with her calm intelligence, noted every detail, every whisper, every glance that lingered too long or darted away too quickly. It was, she realized with her usual understated thrill, the perfect beginning for a mystery. By afternoon, rumors began to circulate. Mrs. Finch claimed she had glimpsed a shadowy figure in the manor's upper window. Mr. Langley, the baker, whispered that the carriage had seemed to move with unusual haste. Even the children, who normally cared little for grown-up affairs, found themselves speculating about the contents of the box, their imaginations running wild with treasures, jewels, and perhaps even secrets that could change the village forever. Miss Marple listened patiently, noting which stories were born of imagination and which carried the faintest trace of truth. It was always in the mixture of the two that clues could be found. As dusk approached, a sudden scream echoed from the direction of the manor, startling the evening calm. Windows were thrown open, and heads popped out to see the cause. Some swore they saw a figure dash behind the hedges. Others claimed it was merely the wind rattling the shutters. But Miss Marple, with her unhurried steps, made her way toward the manor, her mind already piecing together the fragments she had observed throughout the day. The heir met her at the doorway, pale and anxious. "Miss Marple, you must help me," he implored. "Something has happened, and I fear it is dreadful." She inclined her head slightly, the faintest glimmer of a smile on her lips. "Let us see, then. Calm observation will reveal more than panicked speculation ever could." And with that, Willowbrook's quiet streets and the imposing Silent Manor became the scene of a mystery that would test even Miss Marple's extraordinary powers of insight. Little did anyone know, the event set in motion that afternoon would uncover not just family secrets, but truths long buried, truths that some would go to great lengths to protect, even at the cost of life itself. Chapter 3. The Whisper of Secrets. As dawn broke over Willowbrook, a pale light filtered through the mist, touching the cobblestone streets and the ivy-draped cottages with a soft, almost ethereal glow, yet within the Silent Manor the atmosphere remained taut with quiet anticipation, the box from London still resting on the polished oak table as though it were the very heart of the house, and Miss Marple, seated in the corner of the great hall with her knitting in hand, observed everything with calm precision, noting the subtle movements of the heir as he paced restlessly, the way his eyes darted toward the windows and back toward the object, the faint tremor in his hands as if the weight of the family legacy pressed down upon him with an invisible hand, while outside, the village was awakening to the ordinary hum of daily life, unaware of the tension lurking on the hill, the villagers gossiping about the scream from the previous day, some suggesting ghosts, others imagining thieves, yet none truly understanding the gravity of what had arrived in their midst, and Miss Marple, with her long experience in human nature and its endless capacity for secrecy and deception, knew that the reactions of those around her would reveal far more than any spoken word, for it was often in what people tried to conceal, the slight hesitation, the too quick glance, the faintest intake of breath, that the truth made itself known. She observed the heir speaking to the footman who had delivered the box, the young man's words. Careful and measured, yet betraying anxiety despite his attempts at composure, and she noted the tiny details, the slight scratch along the edge of the box, a crease in the ribbon that suggested it had been handled with intent, the subtle warmth in the varnished wood, as though it had been touched moments ago, and the faint scent of lavender that lingered in the air, delicate yet persistent, making her think of sachets used to mask other odors, of secrets hidden beneath polite appearances, and, as she considered these details, her mind worked methodically, weaving together the threads of observation and deduction that would allow her, eventually, to see what no one else could, and then came the sudden sound of a door creaking, almost imperceptible, from the direction of the library, causing both the heir and the footman to flinch, yet Miss Marple, unstartled, merely inclined her head, noting the timing, the subtle shift in air currents, the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and move, as if alive, and she moved toward the source of the sound with calm determination, her eyes sweeping across the richly carpeted floor, the walls lined with heavy bookshelves, the portraits of ancestors staring down with the austere disapproval of bygone generations, each detail catalogued in her mind, ready to reveal the hidden truth. She knelt to examine the carpet, noticing a faint indentation where someone or something had shifted, just enough to leave a mark, and the dust on the nearby table had been slightly disturbed, suggesting that a careful hand had passed over it, while the faint lavender scent grew stronger in this room, teasing her awareness, and as she considered these subtle clues, she realized that they pointed not to a ghost or a figment of imagination, but to a human hand guided by knowledge and purpose. And outside, the villagers continued their routines, unaware that the manor had become a stage for a drama of secrecy and suspense. Yet Miss Marple, with her unhurried wisdom, already began to consider the possibilities, the relationships, the grudges, the fears that might have brought someone to act with such discretion, and she remembered the subtle glances exchanged in the tea-room the day before, the snippets of conversation overheard, the fragment of a letter that hinted at family tensions, and she began to piece together the first threads of what might unravel into a complex web of motives and hidden truths, while the heir watched her closely. Torn between hope and fear, unsure whether to confide everything he knew or remain silent, and Miss Marple, sensing his internal struggle, encouraged him gently to speak freely, for it was only through conversation that the human element of the mystery would come alive, revealing reactions, inconsistencies, and emotions that no observation alone could capture. And as he spoke of distant relatives, old disputes over inheritance, and the curious circumstances surrounding the box's arrival, Miss Marple's mind wove a tapestry of connections, noting what was omitted as much as what was said, aware that silence often spoke louder than words, and as the day progressed, the atmosphere in the manor thickened with anticipation, with shadows growing longer across the richly paneled floors, and the faint echo of yesterday's screams seemed to linger, a reminder that all was not as it seemed, while Miss Marple continued her quiet vigil, observing, deducing, and preparing for the first true test of her insight into the secrets hidden behind polite facades and nervous gestures, knowing that soon the thread she had begun to unravel would lead her to a discovery that would astonish the manor's inhabitants and the village alike. For the true heirloom was not the box itself, but the revelations it would bring. And by evening, as the candlelight flickered across the polished surfaces and the manor settled into the uneasy calm of twilight, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile, confident that the game had begun in earnest, that every whisper, every shadow, every subtle motion would contribute to the ultimate unraveling of a mystery that would challenge even her remarkable powers of observation and human understanding. Chapter 4. The Heir's Secret. The morning in Willowbrook arrived with a gentle drizzle that slicked the cobblestones and made the village seem wrapped in a quiet, contemplative mood, yet within the walls of Silent Manor, tension thickened as if the very air had absorbed the unease of the previous day. Miss Marple seated near the tall windows, her knitting idle on her lap, observing everything with the calm scrutiny of someone who knew the subtle ways human nature revealed itself in gestures, hesitations, and the smallest shifts of expression, and the heir, restless and uneasy, moved about the grand hall as though the weight of his inheritance pressed upon him with an invisible hand, his fingers tracing the edges of the box repeatedly, pausing to glance at the intricate carvings and the meticulously tied ribbons that bound it, while outside the village went about its ordinary routines, oblivious to the drama unfolding on the hill. Mrs. Finch arranging flowers in her shop, Mr. Langley tending his bakery, and children splashing through puddles with careless laughter, and yet every sound of normalcy seemed to highlight the tense silence inside the manor, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air as Miss Marple leaned forward, her keen eyes catching the subtle glimmer of varnish on the box that suggested it had been handled recently, a slight depression in the carpet near the fireplace, a dust pattern on the oak desk disturbed, all indicating that someone had been in the room when no one else was meant to be, and she noted, too, the heir's anxious glances toward the staircase and the closed doors, the small clench of his jaw when he thought no one was looking, the way his hands trembled just enough to betray his nerves despite his attempts at composure, and she quietly catalogued everything, aware that in these tiny, overlooked details lay the beginning of a web of truth, while the servants moved silently about, careful not to disturb the fragile tension, though their whispered concerns occasionally drifted through the corridors, adding layers of subtle distraction and fear. And Miss Marple, with her calm understanding of human psychology, considered each fragment, each piece of behavior, each scent and sound, knowing that the human heart often carried more secrets than any object could, that fear, guilt, and anticipation left marks that were invisible to the untrained eye but obvious to hers. And she reflected on the box itself, its polished wood and delicate ribbons, the seal that seemed to demand respect, the mysterious instructions that it not be opened until the proper time, all suggesting that what it contained was more than mere objects, that it was a vessel of family history, secrets, and perhaps motives that could drive even the most ordinary person to extraordinary actions. And as she pondered, the heir finally spoke, his voice low, edged with desperation, telling her of a letter he had found tucked behind a loose panel in the library, written in a careful, elegant hand, the ink slightly faded, the words cryptic yet urgent, warning of disputes and grievances long buried, of promises broken and debts unpaid, hints of quarrels over inheritance that had never been resolved openly. And Miss Marple listened attentively, noting not only the content of the letter but the heir's hesitation as he recounted it, the slight catch in his breath when mentioning certain names, the way he avoided meeting her eyes when discussing his late relatives, all of which told her far more than the words themselves, for in human nature, concealment is as revealing as confession, and she made a mental note to follow each of these threads carefully, to see where they led and what they concealed, while outside the manor, the fog began to thicken, curling around the spires of the church and the thatched roofs of the cottages, adding a sense of isolation and suspense, the village appearing both quaint and ominous under the grey light. And inside, Miss Marple rose to examine the box more closely, running her fingers over the carvings, noting the slight warmth in certain areas that suggested recent handling, the faint scent of old parchment that mingled with the lavender, the subtle tilt of the ribbons as if they had been adjusted, and she considered all possibilities. A prank, a warning, an attempted theft, or something far more sinister. And then her attention shifted to the heir's manner, the tension in his shoulders, the rapid flicker of his eyes toward the closed doors, the careful way he moved through the hall as though expecting unseen observers, and she realized that the mystery was not merely in the box or the manor, but in the people themselves, their hidden motives, old resentments, and the weight of family history pressing down upon them like a tangible force. And as the day wore on, Miss Marple began to piece together a delicate map of interactions, noticing which servants avoided certain rooms, which hallways were rarely used, the slight smudges of fingerprints on the windows, the faint scuff marks on the staircase, all of which hinted at movements and actions unspoken, while the heir continued to confide his worries, each revelation layered with unintentional hints, contradictions, and subtle signs that Miss Marple catalogued silently, understanding that the real mystery was always human, that objects and letters and boxes were merely instruments to reveal what people wished to conceal. And as evening approached, the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, the sky outside darkening, the fog curling around the hedgerows and the gates like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise on a drama whose actors were unseen. Yet Miss Marple felt the first stirrings of understanding, the outline of a puzzle slowly emerging from the chaos of fear and secrecy, and she smiled faintly to herself, confident that by following the threads of observation, conversation, and subtle behavior, she would uncover not only the meaning of the box and its heirloom, but the truths that Willowbrook itself had kept hidden beneath polite facades. And as the candlelight flickered across the polished floors, casting shadows that danced like spectres along the walls, Miss Marple remained poised, calm, and fully aware that the real test of her intelligence, patience, and insight had only just begun, for in the coming days, every whisper, every shadow, every anxious glance would serve as a clue, leading her to a revelation that would astonish all and restore order to a world temporarily suspended in mystery and suspense. Chapter 5. The Unseen Visitor. The morning sun filtered weakly through the heavy clouds over Willowbrook, casting long, muted shadows across the village, yet within Silent Manor the atmosphere was taut with anticipation and unspoken anxiety. Miss Marple seated near the tall bay windows, her eyes scanning every corner of the grand hall while the air moved restlessly, glancing repeatedly at the box that had become the center of every concern, every whispered speculation, and every hidden fear, for it was clear that the heir's nerves were fraying under the weight of family expectations, the mysterious arrival of the heirloom, and the strange occurrences that had already unsettled him. And Miss Marple, with her unmatched patience and acute perception, observed the minutest details, the subtle tremor in his hands when he reached for the ribbons, the slight hesitation before speaking, the fleeting glances toward the staircase and the closed doors, the way the air seemed charged with expectation, as though the manor itself were holding its breath in anticipation of revelation, while outside the village began its daily routines unaware of the tension perched atop the hill, the baker arranging fresh loaves in his window, children running with careless laughter through puddles, and villagers pausing briefly to exchange idle gossip about the scream that had reverberated from Silent Manor the day before. Yet Miss Marple knew that within the mundane, the extraordinary often lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered by a careful observer, and she considered the box once more, its polished wood glinting subtly in the dim light, the ribbons taut, the varnish warm in certain places as though it had been touched moments ago, the faint scent of lavender weaving delicately through the room, and she realized that the object was not merely a container but a catalyst, its arrival triggering fear, anticipation, and curiosity that revealed the hidden currents of the manor's occupants and their interactions. And then the heir, pacing nervously, admitted that he had noticed small, unexplained disturbances overnight. The faint creak of floorboards where no one had walked, the subtle displacement of objects that had been carefully arranged, a whisper, perhaps imagined, that had seemed to float through the corridor, and Miss Marple listened attentively, noting not only what he said but what he omitted, the tiny pauses that betrayed his uncertainty, the careful selection of words, and she catalogued every detail in her mind, understanding that human behavior often disclosed more than spoken testimony, and as she considered the possibilities, a sudden shadow fell across the hallway, and the footman glanced nervously toward the entrance, muttering that he thought he saw someone passing the window, yet when they looked, no one was there, and Miss Marple, unperturbed, rose to examine the scene, her eyes sweeping the corridor, noting the footprints in the dust near the main door, the slight smear on the polished floor, the way the curtains fluttered as if stirred by a passing figure, and she recognized the subtle signs of a visitor who had moved carefully to avoid detection, yet whose presence left traces despite every effort to remain unseen, and she reflected on the heir's accounts, the disturbances, the faint lavender scent, and the box itself, weaving together a hypothesis that was as delicate as it was compelling, that the visitor had a purpose, likely tied to the heirloom, yet whether friend or foe remained uncertain, and as the day progressed, Miss Marple continued her careful observation, noting which servants seemed more alert, which ones avoided certain rooms, the way the heir moved with tension in his shoulders and a careful wariness in his eyes, the small inconsistencies in statements when recounting the morning's events, and all of these tiny details formed a complex map of behavior and motive that only she could read, while the weather outside reflected the growing tension within the manor, clouds gathering, a fine drizzle beginning to fall, and shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower, lending the halls a dusky, almost oppressive atmosphere, and Miss Marple considered the implications of an unseen visitor, the manner in which the house seemed to respond to their presence, and the subtle psychological effects on the heir, who alternated between nervous excitement and cautious restraint, aware that the manor's secrets, now entwined with the mysterious box, were drawing him toward truths that had long been buried, and then she turned her attention once more to the box, its ribbons seemingly tighter, the varnish gleaming as though it were aware of the scrutiny it received, and she realized that its significance was not merely material but symbolic, carrying within it the weight of expectations, legacies, and hidden tensions that spanned generations, and as evening approached, the heir confided additional observations. A faint smell of candle smoke where no candle had been lit, a subtle draught from a window that should have remained closed, the feeling that he was being watched, all signs that someone had moved through the manor with purpose and care, leaving only faint traces behind, and Miss Marple, absorbing every word, noted that these were the threads she needed to pull, the clues that would lead her eventually to the heart of the mystery, while outside, the village settled into the quiet of dusk, unaware that within Silent Manor the game had begun in earnest, a game of patience, observation, and insight in which the smallest gestures, the subtlest movements, and the faintest hints would reveal the truth, and she reflected on the nature of fear and anticipation, how the mind embellishes and distorts, how expectation can transform ordinary events into something extraordinary, and she considered the heir's psychology, his reactions, his careful concealment of certain details, and how these human factors intertwined with the tangible clues, the box, the disturbed objects, the faint scents, the shadows, to form a complex puzzle that only a mind attuned to human nature could hope to decipher, and as night fell, candles flickering along the hallways, casting wavering shadows that seemed almost alive, Miss Marple felt a quiet confidence, knowing that the unseen visitor, the heirloom, and the manor itself were all pieces of a larger story, a story that she would unravel with patience, intelligence, and her unique understanding of the human heart, and as she sat in contemplative silence, the faint sounds of the manor settling around her, she understood that the events of the day were merely the prelude to discoveries that would astonish all who dwelled there, for in Silent Manor, beneath the polite facades and careful behaviors, lay secrets long hidden, and Miss Marple, ever observant, ever patient, would reveal them in due course. For the true heirloom of the manor was not simply the object in the box, but the revelation of truths that had long been concealed, and by following the faintest traces, the smallest inconsistencies, the subtle human reactions, she would bring to light a mystery that would astonish, unsettle, and ultimately restore clarity and understanding to a house long shrouded in silence and shadows. Chapter 7: Secrets in the Shadows. The early morning fog hung low over Willowbrook, curling around the hedgerows and rooftops like silent fingers, and within the walls of Silent Manor, the tension thickened as though the air itself had absorbed the anxiety of its inhabitants. Miss Marple seated near the wide bay windows, her knitting abandoned on her lap, eyes sweeping every inch of the grand hall with a patient precision that only decades of observation could cultivate, noting the subtle twitch of the heir's shoulders, the careful avoidance of certain corners, the way his eyes flicked toward doors that remained closed, and the faint traces of dust disturbed on the polished floors, suggesting movement that had not been acknowledged, while outside the village remained oblivious, the baker setting fresh loaves in his window, the postman clattering along the streets, and the occasional dog barking in the distance. Yet these ordinary sounds only served to heighten the contrast with the charged, almost oppressive, atmosphere inside the manor, and Miss Marple considered the box once more, its polished wood gleaming faintly in the soft morning light, the ribbons perfectly tied, yet with a slight indentation here and there as though fingers had rested upon it, a faint warmth lingering that indicated recent handling, and she realized that the box was not merely an object but a focal point around which human tension, curiosity, and fear converged. And then the air, restless and pale, spoke quietly of a series of odd events from the previous night, subtle but unsettling, the faint creak of floorboards where no one had walked, the whisper of a door gently closing when it should have remained open, shadows flitting at the edges of candlelight, and Miss Marple noted the heir's careful choice of words, the pauses, the fleeting glances toward the windows, each small gesture betraying more than he intended, revealing both fear and an awareness that the manor held secrets he could neither fully name nor confront. While the servants moved about with restrained precision, their whispered conversations and sidelong glances adding layers of subtle tension, and Miss Marple catalogued everything. The heir's body language, the disturbances in the room, the traces of scent and movement, the faint smell of lavender interwoven with something more acrid, almost metallic, and she understood that these elements combined to form a map of unseen activity, each anomaly a potential clue to unraveling the mystery that enveloped the manor, and she reflected on human nature, how fear, guilt, and anticipation left signs far more telling than any object could, that gestures, hesitation, and careful omissions often spoke louder than words, and she considered the interplay of these forces within the household, the heir, the servants, and the manor itself, each element contributing to a puzzle whose edges were gradually coming into focus, while outside the fog thickened, the village dimmed in the gray light, lending an almost ethereal isolation to the hilltop house, and Miss Marple, rising to inspect the box once again, ran her fingers over the carvings, noting the subtle shifts in varnish, the way the ribbons seemed almost imperceptibly altered, the faint impressions on the floor where the box had rested, and the hint of a letter tucked beneath a nearby panel, its edges peeking out as though shyly revealing its existence. And she realized that the manor's mysteries were not limited to tangible objects but extended deeply into the realm of human behavior, for the heir's anxiety, the servants' whispered warnings, and the unseen movements all converged in a pattern that, with patience, could be unraveled, revealing motives, secrets, and ultimately, truth. And as the day progressed, Miss Marple quietly questioned the heir about his recollections of the past weeks, the movements of family members long gone, the minor disputes over inheritance, the strange letters received but never shared, each answer layered with hesitations and contradictions that only sharpened the clarity of the emerging picture, while her observations extended to minute details, the faint dust smudge on a table, the slight tilt of a picture frame, the subtle disarray of cushions on a settee, each indicating human presence and unseen passage, and she catalogued every nuance, aware that in the quietest moments lay the most revealing truths. And then came a faint sound from the corridor, the softest of footsteps, yet deliberate, measured, and Miss Marple immediately noted the direction, the cadence, the subtle vibration along the floorboards, and she deduced that someone was moving through the manor with purpose and care, attempting to remain unseen, yet leaving imperceptible traces, while the heir, sensing movement, stiffened, a shadow of fear crossing his face. Yet Miss Marple, calm and unperturbed, continued her observations, noting how anticipation affected behavior, how tension revealed hidden truths, and how even the most subtle clues could be assembled into a coherent understanding of events. And she considered the box once more, its presence a constant reminder of the intertwining of human curiosity, fear, and desire, and she reflected on the heir's psychological state, how pressure, secrecy, and family expectations weighed heavily upon him, shaping gestures, expressions, and decisions, and how, through careful questioning and patient observation, she could trace the source of unrest, the origin of disturbances, and the motives behind the unseen visitor, for she knew that the manor itself was a repository of both tangible and intangible evidence, that the weight of history, inheritance, and human emotion was embedded in every corner, every shadow, every whisper, and that understanding these elements was essential to unraveling the mystery. And as evening fell, the fading light casting long, restless shadows along the polished floors, Miss Marple felt the first glimmer of insight, the shape of the puzzle beginning to form in her mind, linking disturbances, human reactions, and hidden motives, and she resolved that the coming days would be devoted to meticulous observation, subtle questioning, and patient deduction, for only by attending to the smallest details, by following the threads of human behavior, and by understanding the delicate balance of fear, curiosity, and secrecy, could the full story of Silent Manor, its heirloom, and the unseen visitor be brought to light, and she smiled faintly, confident that, with patience, intelligence, and her deep understanding of human nature, she would uncover the truths hidden in the shadows, revealing the intricate web of secrets that lay at the heart of the manor. And as the candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across walls and polished surfaces, Miss Marple settled into contemplative quiet, her mind tracing patterns invisible to all others, aware that the unfolding mystery was only beginning to yield its secrets, and that the subtle interplay of human behavior, objects, and unseen influences would ultimately expose the truth, illuminating the hidden dynamics of Silent Manor in a revelation both surprising and inevitable. Chapter 6: Shadows and Whispers. The morning in Willowbrook dawned gray and mist-laden, the faint drizzle soaking the cobblestones and cloaking the village in a muted, almost ghostly calm. Yet within Silent Manor, the air was thick with tension and unspoken questions. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner of the great hall, her knitting momentarily set aside as her sharp eyes observed every movement and subtle nuance of the household, noting the heir's restless pacing, the way he adjusted his coat repeatedly as though bracing himself against unseen forces, the tremor in his fingers whenever he touched the box, and the small, almost imperceptible frown that creased his brow as he considered the morning's events, while outside the village carried on unaware, the baker's cart rattling along the street, children's laughter echoing through puddles, and gossiping villagers exchanging theories about the scream from the manor, each adding their own embellishments and exaggerations, yet none perceiving the deeper tension that had settled like a heavy cloak over the hilltop house. And Miss Marple, with her customary patience and quiet intelligence, catalogued the details of both house and inhabitant, noting how the curtains swayed faintly though no breeze entered, the polished floorboards bearing subtle scuff marks where footsteps had brushed in the dark of night, the faint scent of lavender mingling with something sharper, something metallic, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to her attentive senses. And she reflected on the heir's account of restless nights, fleeting glimpses of shadows in corners, objects ever so slightly displaced, all hinting at the presence of an observer, someone who moved with knowledge and purpose, careful not to be noticed, yet leaving traces behind. And she considered the heir himself, the subtle cues in his behavior that suggested both fear and hidden knowledge, the way he avoided certain subjects, the pauses that punctuated his speech when asked about relatives or prior events, the way his gaze would flicker toward the box. And she realized that the manor was not only a repository of family heirlooms but also a stage where secrets, anxieties, and old rivalries played out silently, revealing themselves to anyone capable of careful observation. And then came the faint creak of a floorboard from the corridor, drawing the heir's attention instantly, his eyes widening in apprehension. Yet Miss Marple merely inclined her head slightly, noting the sound's origin, the subtle vibration through the wooden panels, the directionality of the echo, each detail another thread in the tapestry she was beginning to weave, while the footman appeared at the doorway, his expression tight, hesitant, as though uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. And Miss Marple, with gentle persistence, encouraged him to recount the night's events, noting how his narrative contained pauses, omissions, and careful word choices, all of which revealed more than his words alone. And as he spoke of glimpses of figures in the hallways, of faint movements behind closed doors, of shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should, Miss Marple catalogued each detail with meticulous care, aware that these observations, combined with the heir's own reactions, would reveal the underlying truth, the connections between past and present, fear and motive. And she reflected on the box itself, polished and silent, its ribbons taut, its varnish warm in places as though touched moments before, the subtle impression that it was almost alive in its stillness, a focal point around which human tension, anticipation, and curiosity converged. And she considered the heir's psychological state, how the presence of an unseen observer, the mysterious nature of the heirloom, and the weight of family history pressed upon him, affecting decisions, gestures, and speech, creating subtle tells that only someone with acute understanding of human nature could perceive. And Miss Marple, aware of these dynamics, formulated a careful plan to observe further, to test reactions, to draw out hidden truths without alarming or pressuring the heir, understanding that patience, gentle questioning, and precise observation were her most powerful tools, while outside, the village's fog thickened, lending an air of isolation to the hilltop manor, shadows lengthening along the stone pathways, blending into the dim corridors of the house itself, and Miss Marple, moving quietly across the hall, examined the edges of the box once more, noting the slight indentation where a hand might have rested, the almost imperceptible shift of dust on the polished floor, the faint smell of old paper and lavender lingering in the air, each a clue pointing toward movements and intentions that had gone unnoticed by less observant eyes, and she recalled the snippets of gossip overheard in the village tea-room, the rumors of quarrels over inheritance, the mention of letters with cryptic content, the subtle jealousies and rivalries long buried beneath polite smiles, all forming a complex web of motives and opportunities that she needed to untangle, while the air, pacing nervously, recounted fragmented memories of previous days, the movement of servants at unusual hours, the sudden appearance of letters with ambiguous handwriting, the strange reactions of those around him, each account layered with emotion, uncertainty, and hesitation, and Miss Marple, absorbing every detail, noted the inconsistencies, the timing of events, the subtle behavioral clues, aware that human psychology often left more evidence than any object or letter ever could, and as night approached, the manor seemed to hold its breath, the candlelight flickering across the polished floors and casting long, restless shadows along the walls, the faint echo of footsteps in the corridors, the gentle sigh of the air as he wrestled with thoughts of duty, inheritance, and fear, all part of a narrative unfolding in real time, with Miss Marple quietly knitting her observations together into a coherent pattern, a roadmap that would ultimately lead to revelation, insight, and resolution, understanding that the unseen visitor, the box, and the air were all pieces of a puzzle whose edges were gradually being defined, and that soon, the first true breakthrough would emerge from the interplay of human behavior, careful observation, and the relentless pursuit of truth. And as she settled into the quiet evening, a faint smile touched her lips, for she knew that patience, attention, and understanding of the human heart would reveal all in time, and that the manor, with its whispers, shadows, and secrets, would ultimately surrender the mysteries it had held so tightly, not through force or accusation, but through quiet, persistent, and intelligent observation, as only Miss Marple could execute with such subtle precision and unerring insight. Chapter 7: Secrets in the Shadows. The early morning fog hung low over Willowbrook, curling around the hedgerows and rooftops like silent fingers, and within the walls of Silent Manor, the tension thickened as though the air itself had absorbed the anxiety of its inhabitants. Miss Marple seated near the wide bay windows, her knitting abandoned on her lap, eyes sweeping every inch of the grand hall with a patient precision that only decades of observation could cultivate, noting the subtle twitch of the heir's shoulders, the careful avoidance of certain corners, the way his eyes flicked toward doors that remained closed, and the faint traces of dust disturbed on the polished floors, suggesting movement that had not been acknowledged, while outside the village remained oblivious, the baker setting fresh loaves in his window, the postman clattering along the streets, and the occasional dog barking in the distance. Yet these ordinary sounds only served to heighten the contrast with the charged, almost oppressive atmosphere inside the manor, and Miss Marple considered the box once more, its polished wood gleaming faintly in the soft morning light, the ribbons perfectly tied, yet with a slight indentation here and there as though fingers had rested upon it, a faint warmth lingering that indicated recent handling, and she realized that the box was not merely an object but a focal point around which human tension, curiosity, and fear converged. And then the air, restless and pale, spoke quietly of a series of odd events from the previous night, subtle but unsettling, the faint creak of floorboards where no one had walked, the whisper of a door gently closing when it should have remained open, shadows flitting at the edges of candlelight, and Miss Marple noted the heir's careful choice of words, the pauses, the fleeting glances toward the windows, each small gesture betraying more than he intended, revealing both fear and an awareness that the manor held secrets he could neither fully name nor confront, while the servants moved about with restrained precision, their whispered conversations and sidelong glances adding layers of subtle tension, and Miss Marple catalogued everything. The heir's body language, the disturbances in the room, the traces of scent and movement, the faint smell of lavender interwoven with something more acrid, almost metallic, and she understood that these elements combined to form a map of unseen activity, each anomaly a potential clue to unraveling the mystery that enveloped the manor, and she reflected on human nature, how fear, guilt, and anticipation left signs far more telling than any object could, that gestures, hesitation, and careful omissions often spoke louder than words, and she considered the interplay of these forces within the household, the heir, the servants, and the manor itself, each element contributing to a puzzle whose edges were gradually coming into focus, while outside the fog thickened, the village dimmed in the gray light, lending an almost ethereal isolation to the hilltop house, and Miss Marple, rising to inspect the box once again, ran her fingers over the carvings, noting the subtle shifts in varnish, the way the ribbon seemed almost imperceptibly altered, the faint impressions on the floor where the box had rested, and the hint of a letter tucked beneath a nearby panel, its edges peeking out as though shyly revealing its existence. And she realized that the manor's mysteries were not limited to tangible objects but extended deeply into the realm of human behavior, for the heir's anxiety, the servant's whispered warnings, and the unseen movements all converged in a pattern that, with patience, could be unraveled, revealing motives, secrets, and ultimately, truth. And as the day progressed, Miss Marple quietly questioned the heir about his recollections of the past weeks, the movements of family members long gone, the minor disputes over inheritance, the strange letters received but never shared, each answer layered with hesitations and contradictions that only sharpened the clarity of the emerging picture, while her observations extended to minute details, the faint dust smudge on a table, the slight tilt of a picture frame, the subtle disarray of cushions on a settee, each indicating human presence and unseen passage, and she catalogued every nuance, aware that in the quietest moments lay the most revealing truths. And then came a faint sound from the corridor, the softest of footsteps, yet deliberate, measured, and Miss Marple immediately noted the direction, the cadence, the subtle vibration along the floorboards, and she deduced that someone was moving through the manor with purpose and care, attempting to remain unseen, yet leaving imperceptible traces, while the heir, sensing movement, stiffened, a shadow of fear crossing his face. Yet Miss Marple, calm and unperturbed, continued her observations, noting how anticipation affected behavior, how tension revealed hidden truths, and how even the most subtle clues could be assembled into a coherent understanding of events. And she considered the box once more, its presence a constant reminder of the intertwining of human curiosity, fear, and desire, and she reflected on the heir's psychological state, how pressure, secrecy, and family expectations weighed heavily upon him, shaping gestures, expressions, and decisions, and how, through careful questioning and patient observation, she could trace the source of unrest, the origin of disturbances, and the motives behind the unseen visitor, for she knew that the manor itself was a repository of both tangible and intangible evidence, that the weight of history, inheritance, and human emotion was embedded in every corner, every shadow, every whisper, and that understanding these elements was essential to unraveling the mystery. And as evening fell, the fading light casting long, restless shadows along the polished floors, Miss Marple felt the first glimmer of insight, the shape of the puzzle beginning to form in her mind, linking disturbances, human reactions, and hidden motives, and she resolved that the coming days would be devoted to meticulous observation, subtle questioning, and patient deduction, for only by attending to the smallest details, by following the threads of human behavior, and by understanding the delicate balance of fear, curiosity, and secrecy, could the full story of Silent Manor, its heirloom, and the unseen visitor be brought to light. And she smiled faintly, confident that, with patience, intelligence, and her deep understanding of human nature, she would uncover the truths hidden in the shadows, revealing the intricate web of secrets that lay at the heart of the manor. And as the candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across walls and polished surfaces, Miss Marple settled into contemplative quiet, her mind tracing patterns invisible to all others, aware that the unfolding mystery was only beginning to yield its secrets, and that the subtle interplay of human behavior, objects, and unseen influences would ultimately expose the truth, illuminating the hidden dynamics of Silent Manor in a revelation both surprising and inevitable. Chapter 8. The Hidden Passage. The manor seemed to hold its breath that morning, the fog clinging stubbornly to the hedgerows outside Willowbrook, the faint drizzle forming small puddles along the winding stone pathways, and inside Silent Manor, every creak of floorboard, every whisper of draught through a cracked window became amplified in the heavy stillness. Miss Marple seated near the hearth, her eyes tracing the angles of the room, noting the faint smudge on the polished floors where dust had shifted subtly, the imperceptible displacement of cushions on the settee, the slight tilt of a painting, all telling a story invisible to all but the most careful observer, while the heir moved restlessly, glancing at the box with a mixture of anxiety and reverence, his hands twitching ever so slightly as he considered opening it. And Miss Marple, with her patient insight, noted the almost imperceptible signs of strain, the set of his shoulders, the way his lips pressed together when he paused mid-sentence, the brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes when asked about the disturbances in the night, all of which revealed far more than his words alone. And she catalogued these observations, combining them with subtle environmental cues, the faint smell of lavender lingering despite the damp air, a shadow that seemed to pause at the edge of the hall, a draught that whispered through a door that should have remained closed, and she reflected that these were the footprints of a visitor whose movements were deliberate, cautious, yet leaving traces, and then the air, suddenly recalling a fragment of memory, mentioned the possibility of a hidden passage, a feature in the manor whispered about in old letters, obscure maps, and family stories long dismissed as legend, and Miss Marple, intrigued, considered the implications, for if a passage existed, it would explain many of the subtle disturbances. The faint scuff marks on floors in unlikely locations, the soft creak of a door opening from within the walls, the unaccounted for shifts in dust and shadow, and she noted the air's body language, the mix of excitement and trepidation that accompanied the revelation, and she knew that the psychological weight of discovery was as important as the physical truth, that fear, anticipation, and curiosity all shaped behavior and could guide her toward understanding, while outside, the village began its mundane routines. The postman rattling along the streets, the baker arranging fresh loaves in the window, children's laughter echoing through puddles, none aware of the complex drama unfolding atop the hill, and Miss Marple reflected on the contrast between ordinary life and the layered tensions within Silent Manor, understanding that the extraordinary often hides within the ordinary, and that careful observation, patience, and an understanding of human nature were keys to revealing it. And as the air spoke more of vague recollections, Miss Marple noted the small inconsistencies in his account, the fleeting hesitation when describing certain corridors, the sudden brightening of his eyes when mentioning corners he recalled exploring as a child, each detail a thread she could follow, and then, as if compelled by intuition, she rose and quietly moved toward a corner of the library where a faint draught seemed to originate, her keen eyes observing the walls, the floor, the angles of the bookshelves, noting that something was slightly misaligned, a space where the dust lay undisturbed while the surrounding area bore traces of activity, and she tapped gently along the baseboards, noting a hollow sound, the faintest vibration beneath her fingertips, and the air, standing nearby, stiffened with anticipation, sensing the significance of her discovery, and Miss Marple, with calm authority, suggested examining the panel more closely, noting that the manor's architecture, combined with human curiosity and practical need, often concealed hidden spaces, and she recalled stories of similar passages in other old houses she had encountered, designed for secrecy, safety, or discretion, and she catalogued the subtle evidence that pointed to such a passage here, the faint lines along the wood, the draught, the irregularity in dust patterns, and she explained gently to the air how even the most careful intruder could not erase every trace. That observation and understanding of human behavior and environmental cues revealed more than force or search ever could, and as they examined the wall together, Miss Marple detected a small indentation, barely visible, which, when pressed, caused a section of paneling to shift slightly, revealing a narrow, dark opening beyond, and the air's breath caught in his throat, the tension and excitement coiling in his chest, while Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her mind already piecing together the significance, the possibilities, the history, and the potential for secrets long hidden to emerge at last. And she noted that the passage was narrow, perhaps long disused, the floor uneven, dust layered with the faint evidence of movement, as if someone had passed through it recently yet tried carefully to avoid detection, and she catalogued every clue, the faint scent of lavender stronger here, the subtle metallic note, the evidence of careful, deliberate presence, the way the air shifted as they approached. And she reflected that understanding the human element, the motives, fears, and actions of those who had entered or used the passage, was essential to unraveling the full story, while the air, cautiously peering into the darkness, trembled with a mixture of fear and fascination, aware that within this hidden space lay truths that had shaped the manor for decades, and Miss Marple, unshaken, considered the potential scenarios, the sequence of events, the human behaviors that had produced this moment, understanding that observation, patience, and careful reasoning were the only tools necessary to navigate the delicate web of secrets, motives, and opportunity that surrounded the heirloom, the passage, and the manor itself, and she instructed the air to retrieve a lantern, and as the soft glow illuminated the interior of the narrow corridor, the walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation, and every small detail, the texture of the walls, the uneven floorboards, the faint traces of footprints, was catalogued with precision, each contributing to the mental map Miss Marple was forming, linking the disturbances, the movements, and the psychological state of those involved, and as they cautiously advanced, the faintest whisper of sound reached them, a subtle echo that suggested someone else had been present recently, careful, deliberate, unseen, and Miss Marple noted the rhythm, the direction, the spacing, all revealing subtle clues about the visitor's purpose, intent, and level of caution, and she reflected that every hidden corner, every unexplained noise, every shift in dust or shadow was a testament to human presence and intention, and that the key to solving the mystery lay not in rushing forward, but in understanding, observing, and patiently piecing together these subtle indicators, for in the manor. Chapter 9. Echoes of the Past. The hidden passage stretched before them like a secret artery running through the heart of Silent Manor, its narrow walls suffused with a faint scent of old wood, lavender, and something metallic, a combination that set Miss Marple's mind working in careful, deliberate patterns as she catalogued every detail with her usual precision, noting the uneven floorboards, the subtle indentations where footsteps had pressed into the dust, the faint traces of fabric caught on rough edges of the wall, all suggesting the passage had been used recently, yet cautiously, deliberately, and as the heir followed behind, his lantern casting a trembling circle of light that barely reached the far corners, his breathing shallow with a mixture of anticipation and fear, Miss Marple's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the air, for she understood that in every movement, every hesitation, every glance lay the echoes of human intention, the story of those who had entered before them, and the story they were about to uncover, and as they advanced, the faint creaking of the boards beneath their feet seemed amplified, echoing through the narrow corridor in a rhythm almost like a heartbeat, while outside the manor, the fog clung stubbornly to Willowbrook, muffling the village's ordinary sounds and giving the hilltop house an almost ethereal isolation. And she considered how the combination of the passage's concealment and human expectation had shaped behaviors, how fear, curiosity, and desire to conceal or discover left subtle traces in the environment, each an unspoken testimony to past actions, and then, at a slight bend in the corridor, Miss Marple noted a faint glimmer, a reflection off something metallic half buried in dust, a small clasp, possibly part of a forgotten key or decorative element, and she paused, pointing it out to the heir, who bent to examine it, the corners of his mouth tight, his fingers trembling slightly, and she reflected on the psychological impact of discovery, how the sudden proof of human activity could stir both excitement and anxiety, and how such reactions could themselves be revealing, offering insight into character and motive, while she catalogued the layers of evidence. The fresh smudge along a wall that should have been untouched, the faint imprint of a hand on the worn floorboards, the subtle shifts in dust indicating movements made with caution and purpose, the slight variations in air currents suggesting openings or gaps elsewhere in the walls, all forming a map that only patient observation could decipher, and as they continued, the heir recounted fragmented memories, stories he had long dismissed as childhood imaginings, tales of servants moving silently through corridors, whispers of family members long deceased, rumors of hidden safes and concealed rooms, and Miss Marple listened carefully, noting where memory faltered, where hesitation crept into speech, where eagerness suggested hope or fear, and she understood that the manor's history was layered, each generation adding its own actions, deceptions, and concealments, each leaving traces that careful observation could uncover, and then, at the far end of the passage, they found a section of wall that differed subtly from the rest, the wood slightly darker, the grain more pronounced, the dust undisturbed in a small rectangle, and Miss Marple immediately recognized it as a concealed door, likely the threshold to the next stage of discovery. And she instructed the heir to steady his lantern, noting the psychological tension in his body as he prepared to confront the unknown, the careful balance of fear and curiosity, anticipation and dread, and as she pushed gently against the panel, it shifted with a quiet click, revealing a small chamber beyond, the walls lined with shelves that bore objects covered in cloth, their shapes suggestive but mysterious, and the heir gasped softly, a sound that echoed in the narrow space, while Miss Marple, serene as ever, noted the alignment of objects, the pattern of dust, the faint traces of fingerprints on some, and the subtle signs of human activity intended to remain hidden, and she reflected that the chamber, though small, contained a concentrated essence of the manor's secrets, a repository where history, fear, greed, and care had left tangible imprints for the observant eye. And as the heir stepped forward to lift a cloth, revealing a delicate silver casket, her mind catalogued the possibilities, the connections between heirloom, hidden passage, disturbances, and human behavior, for the casket, though seemingly innocuous, was a focal point, drawing both attention and action, shaping the interactions, fears, and movements of those around it, and Miss Marple's quiet assessment noted the faint warmth of recent handling, the subtle shift of dust indicating where it had rested differently, and she understood that these details, seemingly trivial, were crucial to unraveling the mystery that enveloped the manor, while the heir carefully replaced the covering, noting the need for discretion and the weight of responsibility he felt in handling objects so intimately tied to family history, and Miss Marple, observing the subtle interplay of emotion and behavior, understood how the pressures of legacy, secrecy, and expectation influenced even the smallest actions. How fear of discovery and desire to protect intertwined, creating a complex web of motives, and she catalogued each nuance with patient diligence, recognizing that the truth of Silent Manor could only emerge through careful attention to these details, while the hidden passage itself seemed almost to breathe, holding the echoes of footsteps, whispers, and decisions made in secrecy, waiting for the right observer to connect them, and Miss Marple, quietly noting the air's reactions, the evidence of recent and past movements, and the subtle cues in the environment, began to assemble a pattern, a mental map, linking human behavior, objects, and architecture, understanding that the revelation of one small chamber, one hidden casket, could illuminate a much larger narrative, the hidden forces, rivalries, and secrets that shaped the manor over decades. And as they exited the chamber, the heir's steps were more measured, his breathing slower but tense, his eyes scanning the walls and floor for further clues, and Miss Marple, her mind already tracing the paths, motivations, and unseen influences, reflected on the delicate interplay of observation, deduction, and understanding human nature, for in every slight movement, every pause, every subtle trace lay the story of actions, intentions, and consequences, and she knew that with patience, intelligence, and careful analysis, the full story of the manor, its heirloom, and the invisible forces at play would soon be revealed. And as they returned to the hall, the fog outside thickening and muffling the sounds of Willowbrook, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, confident that the threads of mystery, woven through walls, shadows, and human behavior, were beginning to unravel under her steady, observant eye, and that the truth, though long concealed, would emerge fully, as subtle, patient observation always brings hidden realities to light, and the manor, with its whispering walls, hidden passages, and secrets long kept, would finally yield its story to the calm intelligence of Miss Marple. Chapter 10. The Whispered Letter. The morning light filtered dimly through the tall, narrow windows of Silent Manor, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to dance with the quiet secrets of the house. Miss Marple seated in her usual chair near the hearth, knitting forgotten in her lap as her eyes followed the subtle movements of dust in the sunlight, the heir standing nervously nearby, occasionally glancing at the hidden passage they had explored the day before. And Miss Marple's mind catalogued every detail, the soft creak of a floorboard, the faint scent of lavender mingling with the metallic tang that lingered in the air, the slight shift in shadows as curtains swayed with a gentle breeze, each element contributing to a map of activity, intention, and hidden truths, while outside, Willowbrook remained unaware of the intricate drama unfolding atop the hill, the baker arranging fresh loaves, the postman rattling along cobbled streets, the chatter of villagers drifting faintly to the manor, and Miss Marple considered how ordinary life and extraordinary secrets coexisted, how human behavior, driven by fear, curiosity, and desire, left subtle clues that could be observed, interpreted, and connected, and as she turned her attention to the air, she noted the anxious glances toward the hallway where the hidden passage awaited, the faint tremor in his hands, the restless shifting of his weight, all telling a story of anticipation and uncertainty, and then, with a careful hand, he retrieved from a drawer a folded envelope, yellowed with age, its edges worn, and a faint wax seal partially broken, and Miss Marple observed the subtle way he handled it, the delicate hesitation, the unspoken reverence for what it contained, understanding that in human gestures lay as much meaning as in written words, and as she leaned forward to examine it, she noted the faint imprint of fingerprints on the envelope, the slight smudge of dust where it had rested, the subtle curve of the paper as though it had been unfolded carefully many times, and she catalogued these observations, aware that the letter itself, though small and unassuming, could illuminate connections, motives, and actions far beyond its physical form, and as the heir carefully opened it, the soft rustle of paper echoed in the hall, the words inside barely legible in the faded ink, a message written long ago yet resonating with the present, a whisper from the past that spoke of debts owed, of promises broken, of secrets hidden under layers of decorum, and Miss Marple's eyes, keen and patient, traced each line, noting subtle corrections, slight pauses in the flow of ink, the variations in pressure, all hinting at the writer's emotional state, their intentions, and the weight of their conscience, while the heir's face shifted with recognition and unease, his eyes flickering over the words, his lips pressing together, and Miss Marple observed every micro-expression, the tightening of a jaw, the dilation of pupils, the brief catch of breath, all indicators of psychological reaction, and she catalogued them, understanding that the human element, the heir's connection to the letter, his emotions, and his responses, was as significant as the words themselves, and then she considered the manor as a whole, the hidden passage, the rooms, the shadows, the objects, each contributing to a web of history, secrecy, and human behavior. Each subtle anomaly a signpost pointing toward hidden truths, and she reflected that fear, curiosity, and desire to protect or uncover combined to create patterns visible only to a careful observer, and she began to trace those patterns, linking the disturbances in the passage, the chamber, and now the letter, forming a mental map of the interactions, motives, and concealed actions that had shaped events, while the heir, holding the letter with reverence and trepidation, recounted fragments of family stories, tales of past generations, disputes over inheritance, minor quarrels now transformed into layers of meaning with the passage of time, and Miss Marple listened, noting where memory faltered, where hesitation indicated unspoken truths, where eagerness or relief suggested secrets long carried, and as she observed, she catalogued every tiny movement, the slight shifting of weight, the nervous clearing of a throat, the fleeting glance toward a window or door. For in these subtle acts lay the emotional truth behind the events, and then, turning her attention fully to the letter, she noted a faint watermark, a hidden emblem embedded in the paper, perhaps a sign of its origin or significance, and she considered how the combination of material evidence, human behavior, and environmental cues could illuminate not only the content of the letter but the context of its secrecy, while outside, the fog over Willowbrook thickened, muffling distant sounds, lending the manor a sense of isolation and amplifying the tension within, and Miss Marple reflected on how isolation, both physical and psychological, often revealed more than ordinary interactions, how fear and anticipation shaped human gestures and decisions, and how, with careful observation, these could be traced to uncover hidden truths, and she catalogued the way the heir's fingers trembled as he held the letter, the slight change in his posture, the way his gaze lingered on certain phrases, indicating their emotional significance, and she considered the possible implications, what actions had been taken to conceal, what motives remained unspoken, what consequences awaited, and how these intertwined with the manor's hidden passage, the chamber, and the heirloom, forming a complex web of history, secrecy, and intention, and then, with a calm authority, she suggested they consider the broader context, examining who had access to the passage, who knew of the chamber, what circumstances had led to the letter being hidden, and how the various players had interacted, intentionally or unwittingly, and the heir, his curiosity mingled with fear, began to speculate cautiously, sharing only what he felt certain of, while Miss Marple noted the subtle cues, the pauses, the micro-expressions that revealed more than words, cataloguing each in her mental map, aware that patience, observation, and understanding human nature were the keys to unraveling the mystery, and as the day progressed, she traced connections between past actions, present tension, and future possibilities, noting the intricate interplay between hidden spaces, human behavior, and tangible clues, understanding that the manor, the heirloom, the letter, and the secret passage were all part of a narrative carefully layered over decades, and that only through diligent attention to every detail, no matter how small, could the truth be revealed, while the heir, absorbed in the discovery, remained both anxious and fascinated, his movements careful, respectful, as if the manor itself demanded patience and decorum, and Miss Marple, serene, observed all, connecting patterns, motives, and subtle environmental cues into a coherent picture, ready to follow each thread to uncover the secrets concealed within the shadows, the walls, and the whispers of Silent Manor, confident that careful observation, deduction, and understanding of human nature would ultimately illuminate the past, reveal the present truths, and expose the hidden machinations surrounding the heirloom, the letter, and the long-kept secrets of the house. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shafts of light across the hall, Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of progress. Chapter 11. The Locked Cabinet. The day had grown heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth drifting in from the gardens, mixing with the familiar aroma of polished wood and old books in Silent Manor. Miss Marple seated in her favorite chair near the fireplace, her eyes tracing the subtle movements of shadows as sunlight shifted through the tall windows, the heir pacing nearby with a restless energy, his fingers brushing along the spines of books and the edges of furniture as if seeking hidden reassurance, while Miss Marple's mind catalogued every detail, the faint smudge on the polished floorboards, the slight tilt of a painting, the irregular dust patterns suggesting recent but cautious activity, the distant echo of a door closing elsewhere in the house, and she reflected on the intricate interplay of human behavior and the physical environment, understanding that each tiny clue could reveal far more than spoken words, and then, as if compelled by intuition, her gaze settled upon a tall, dark wooden cabinet in the corner of the study, its surface gleaming but marked by subtle scratches and a slightly warped panel, and she noted the faint scent of wax and a small, precise indentation where a key might fit, the evidence of repeated handling yet careful concealment, and she considered how such a piece, simple in appearance but carefully maintained, could conceal not only objects but secrets, and the heir, following her gaze, stiffened, his eyes widening slightly, for the cabinet had always been locked. Its key missing, yet its presence evoked whispered stories of valuables, heirlooms, and documents hidden for generations, and Miss Marple, calm and patient, suggested examining the cabinet closely, noting the subtle psychological effect of anticipation, fear, and curiosity on the heir, whose body language betrayed a mixture of eagerness and anxiety, and as they approached, she catalogued the minor inconsistencies in the floor beneath, the slightly uneven dust on the carpet, the tiny indentations. That suggested someone had attempted entry, perhaps with caution, yet left traces nonetheless, and she observed the heir's reaction, noting the brief hesitation, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes flicked toward the windows as if seeking guidance or reassurance, all indicative of human behavior under stress, and she reflected on how these cues, combined with physical evidence, revealed both intent and emotion. While outside, Willowbrook was veiled in mist, the village unaware of. The layered mystery atop the hill, the ordinary rhythm of life contrasting with the extraordinary tension within the manor, and Miss Marple, ever serene, examined the cabinet door, noting the delicate joinery, the slight warp in the panel, the subtle glint of a lock mechanism through a narrow gap, all suggesting the possibility of concealed entry, and she began to trace the likely methods used by previous visitors, the human tendencies toward haste, stealth, or miscalculation, and how these left discernible patterns, each trace a clue to unravel, while the heir retrieved a small lantern to illuminate the keyhole, his hands trembling slightly, and Miss Marple, observing the micro-expressions, the shifts in weight, the careful placement of fingers, catalogued them with a meticulous attention that had revealed so much already in the manner, understanding that behavior under anticipation and secrecy often betrayed more than action alone, and then, with quiet authority, she encouraged the heir to try a careful probing, noting that the balance of patience, gentle pressure, and observation was critical, and as he inserted a slender tool into the lock, the subtle click echoed softly, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal the contents, the air inside smelling faintly of old parchment, wax, and polished wood, and there, partially covered by a velvet cloth, lay a collection of small but significant objects, jewelry, documents, letters, and an intricately carved wooden box. The last clearly worn from use yet carefully preserved, and Miss Marple's eyes traced the arrangement, noting the layering of objects, the subtle traces of human handling, the way some items bore faint fingerprints while others remained untouched, evidence of selective concealment and deliberate care, and as the heir leaned closer, his fingers hovering over the velvet cloth, a mixture of anticipation, reverence, and fear, Miss Marple catalogued every detail, understanding that the psychological weight of the discovery, curiosity, dread, hope, anxiety, was as revealing as the objects themselves, and she considered how such behavior reflected both immediate reaction and long-term influence of family lore, secrets, and tradition, while she traced the patterns of dust, fingerprints, and the faint metallic scent lingering in the air, linking them to the hidden passage, the chamber discovered earlier, and the letter previously found, forming a mental map of movement, motive, and concealment. And then, with careful hands, the heir lifted the wooden box, its lid revealing an ornate interior lined with silk, containing a small key, an intricately folded note, and a tiny, delicate locket, each item seemingly mundane yet imbued with layers of history, secrecy, and potential revelation, and Miss Marple's keen mind traced the possibilities, the ways these objects could connect past actions to present tension, human behavior to hidden motives, while outside, the fog thickened, muffling the ordinary life of Willowbrook and concentrating the manor's quiet intensity, and she reflected on how isolation, secrecy, and anticipation magnified the significance of both action and observation, cataloguing the heir's reactions, the subtle changes in posture, the fleeting expressions of emotion, the cautious handling, all indicators of psychological state and intent, and she considered the broader context, the manor's architecture, the hidden passage, the chamber, the letter, and now the cabinet and its contents, understanding that each element interwove to form a complex narrative of concealment, discovery, and human psychology, and as the heir carefully replaced the velvet cloth, the objects secured yet ready for future examination, Miss Marple noted the faint shift in dust on the floor, the slight displacement of air, the tiny, telling disturbances in the surroundings, all evidence of careful but imperfect secrecy, and she reflected that the story of Silent Manor was gradually revealing itself through patient observation, deduction, and insight into human behavior, for every secret left traces, every fear or desire manifested in action, and every observation could connect the hidden threads, leading to clarity, understanding, and ultimately, truth, while the heir, his tension slowly easing yet still mindful of the manor's quiet authority, followed her guidance, aware that patience, respect, and careful attention were essential in navigating the layered history, mystery, and secrets, and Miss Marple, ever composed, knew that with time, observation, and keen insight, the entirety of the manor's mysteries, including the heirloom, the hidden passages, the letter, and now the locked cabinet, would be revealed, bringing clarity and resolution to a story that had remained concealed for decades. And as they closed the cabinet, the faint echo of its latch seemed to resonate with the accumulated tension and anticipation, a reminder that every secret, however carefully hidden, eventually meets the patient, observant mind, and Miss Marple. Chapter 12. Secrets in the Study. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Silent Manor, throwing lattices of light and shadow across the vast study, the air thick with a mingling scents of polished wood, old paper, and faint traces of wax. Miss Marple seated quietly in her accustomed chair, her eyes sweeping the room with meticulous attention as if the very walls whispered the stories of those who had passed through, and the heir, standing near the fireplace with a small key and note retrieved from the cabinet, hesitated, his gaze flickering nervously between the stacks of books, the grand desk adorned with blotters and inkwells, and the tall shelves that reached toward the ceiling, each lined with leather-bound tomes whose spines bore the faint creases of decades of handling, and Miss Marple noted the minute details, the uneven layer of dust, the slight depressions where volumes had been frequently removed, the faint smudge on a polished surface where a hand had lingered too long, the subtle warmth of a recently moved object, and she catalogued each observation with the quiet patience that had revealed so much already in the manor, understanding that human behavior, driven by anticipation, secrecy, and curiosity, left traces as indisputable as any written record, while outside, Willowbrook remained cloaked in mist, the ordinary life of the village continuing unaware of the delicate unraveling of secrets atop the hill, and as she turned her gaze back to the study, she noticed a slight misalignment of the desk drawers, one jutting subtly farther than the others, a discrepancy invisible to most but glaringly significant to an observer of her acuity, and she considered the possibility that this imperfection concealed yet another secret, a hidden compartment, perhaps containing documents or objects that would shed light on the events surrounding the heirloom and the hidden passage, while the heir, his fingers brushing nervously over the polished surface, spoke haltingly, recounting fragmented memories of family stories, tales of disputes over inheritance, whispered warnings of lost fortunes, and Miss Marple listened carefully, noting where memory faltered, where hesitation hinted at unspoken truths, where eagerness suggested relief or apprehension, and she catalogued every nuance, aware that psychological cues often revealed more than speech itself, and then her gaze fell upon a small, intricately carved box resting atop a high shelf, partially obscured by volumes, its surface catching the light in a subtle gleam, and she inferred that its placement, high and difficult to reach, was intentional, likely designed to keep its contents hidden from casual eyes while remaining accessible to those with knowledge of the manor's intricacies, and she considered how human behavior in concealment often left traces, whether through dust patterns, slight fingerprints, or disrupted air currents, all clues waiting to be observed and interpreted. And as the heir retrieved a step stool, his movements careful and deliberate, Miss Marple catalogued the subtle signs of his emotional state, the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes lingered on the box, the quick, almost imperceptible intake of breath as he prepared to lift it down, each a window into the complex interplay of fear, excitement, and reverence, and she reflected that the psychological impact of discovery, anticipation, and potential revelation often influenced actions more profoundly than the objects themselves, for it is in reaction that truth is sometimes betrayed, and she observed the faint dust shifts on the surrounding shelves as he maneuvered, the slight scratches from the stool's legs, and the way his hands adjusted the box's weight as he lifted it, noting the care with which he handled it, aware that human respect, trepidation, and reverence all manifest in physical movements and subtle behavioral cues, and she catalogued each, understanding that they would provide insight into intent, fear, and attachment, while the box was placed carefully on the desk, its lid opening to reveal a series of letters, each tied with ribbons now faded to muted shades of cream and mauve, their paper brittle, the ink slightly blurred with age, and Miss Marple's eyes traced the handwriting, noting the pressure of the pen, the hesitations, corrections, and flourishes, all indicative of emotion, intent, and urgency, while the heir, his fingers brushing over the ribbons and folded pages, whispered fragmented phrases from memory, tales of promises made and broken, of family honor, grievances, and secrets too long concealed, and Miss Marple catalogued the micro-expressions, the brief tightening of lips, the widening of eyes, the slight pause before a word, each revealing the hidden weight of history and emotion intertwined with these documents, and as she examined the first letter, she noted references to the manor, its passageways, disputes over inheritance, and cryptic mentions of a hidden key, all of which could be linked to the cabinet, the chamber, and the previously discovered heirloom, and she reflected that the manor itself, with its architecture, passages, and objects, acted as both witness and participant in human behavior, recording actions, intentions, and secrets in ways that only a patient and observant mind could decode, while outside, the mist thickened, softening the distant sounds of Willowbrook and amplifying the quiet intensity of the manor's interior, and Miss Marple considered how isolation and concentration of attention magnified perception, how subtle changes in environment and human behavior, when carefully observed, revealed truths that might otherwise remain invisible, and she traced connections between the letters, the key, the hidden box, and the physical environment, understanding that each was part of a web of secrecy and revelation. And she catalogued the heir's reactions, hesitation, reverence, curiosity, and fear as further evidence of the psychological weight carried by these discoveries, and she began to reconstruct a sequence of events, connecting movement through the hidden passage, access to the cabinet, and the concealment of the letters, noting how each action left traces, whether in dust, fingerprints, disturbed air, or subtle behavioral cues, and she reflected on the deliberate care, the concealment, and the calculated exposure of objects as a window into human motive, intent, and morality, while the heir, absorbed in reading the letters, revealed fragments of family knowledge previously unspoken, and Miss Marple catalogued these, noting both what was revealed and what was withheld, for gaps in memory, hesitation, or selective disclosure are as revealing as explicit statements, and she traced patterns of attention, care, and respect in his handling of objects, linking them to past decisions, familial pressure, and the weight of legacy, while the manor itself seemed to respond, the shifting shadows and light emphasizing the drama and secrecy, and Miss Marple, serene and patient, connected each subtle detail into a coherent mental map, understanding that the combination of environmental evidence, human behavior, historical documents, and hidden spaces would ultimately illuminate the full narrative. Chapter 13. The Midnight Discovery. As night settled over Silent Manor, a deep velvet darkness enveloped the house, shadows stretching across walls and floors in long, wavering lines, the faint flicker of candlelight from a study casting glimmers on polished wood and the stacks of books. Miss Marple seated in her usual chair, eyes keen and unblinking, cataloguing every movement, sound, and scent, while the heir moved carefully through the hallways with the letters and heirloom, their paper and metal glinting faintly, the house breathing around them, each floorboard creaking softly under weight, each echo carrying hints of history, the quiet rhythm of the manor almost a companion in itself, and Miss Marple considered the way the house preserved secrets, how its architecture, hidden chambers, and careful concealment acted in concert with human behavior to shape the unfolding mystery, her mind tracing the subtle patterns, the alignment of furniture, the slight indentations in the carpets where steps had fallen, the faint dust disturbances on shelves where hands had lingered, each a clue to past actions, motives, and emotional states, while outside, Willowbrook lay still under a moonless sky, its village life suspended in ordinary slumber, unaware of the intricate web of discovery and tension winding through the manor, and as the heir opened a door leading to the hidden passage, a cool draught wafted through, carrying the scent of aged wood, dust, and faint traces of wax and ink, and Miss Marple noted the subtle quiver in his fingers, the slight hesitation in his posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw, each a silent echo of anticipation, fear, and awe, and as they descended the narrow, winding steps, the faint rustle of paper and distant creaks of the house amplified the tension, Miss Marple observing how each movement revealed character, restraint, and emotional response, while her mind catalogued the physical space, mapping angles, shadows, and points of concealment, considering how the passage itself had been used to hide, protect, and reveal secrets over decades, and then the heir stopped before a small alcove, where a narrow slit in the wall hinted at a hidden compartment, the faint outline visible only to a trained observer, and Miss Marple, with quiet patience, encouraged him to probe gently, observing every micro-expression, every subtle shift in weight and gaze, understanding that these small reactions could betray knowledge, intent, or fear, while his fingers traced the edges of the compartment, pressing gently until a small, nearly invisible catch gave way, the hidden space revealed, and inside lay an assortment of objects, faded letters, a small leather-bound journal, a sealed envelope, and a delicate chain of gold, each object radiating history, secrecy, and significance, and Miss Marple's mind catalogued the arrangement, the order of placement, the wear and fingerprints, the faint impressions left on the paper, all clues to who had handled them. When, and under what circumstances, while the heir's breathing quickened, a mixture of excitement and apprehension evident in every subtle gesture, his eyes scanning the contents, lips pressing together, hands hovering reverently over each item, and Miss Marple noted each expression, each micro-movement, each sign of concealed emotion, for human behavior under stress, secrecy, and anticipation often revealed as much as any physical object, and she considered the letters first, noting the faint smudges in the ink, slight hesitations in writing, corrections, and small flourishes, indicating both emotion and intent, while the journal, its leather worn and edges frayed, contained careful entries, detailing events long past, family disputes, whispered warnings, and cryptic notes regarding heirlooms, inheritance, and concealed treasures, and Miss Marple traced each connection, linking these to the hidden passage, the locked cabinet, and the previously discovered box, understanding that each object served as a node in a network of secrecy, human behavior, and historical consequence, while the sealed envelope, untouched and bearing a faint wax insignia, hinted at information deliberately concealed, its presence a silent challenge to the observer, demanding careful attention, patience, and deduction, and Miss Marple catalogued each detail: the texture of the paper, the subtle embossing of the seal, the faint indentation of initials, the smell of aged ink, all clues pointing toward motive, concealment, and revelation, and she noted the heir's fascination and nervous reverence, the way he lingered over the envelope, almost afraid to break the seal, each hesitation and careful movement revealing layers of emotional response, while the chain of gold, delicate and intricate, glimmered faintly under candlelight, suggesting value both sentimental and material. And Miss Marple considered how objects of beauty, utility, or inheritance often carried hidden significance, not only in what they were but in how they were treated, concealed, or revealed over time, and as the night deepened, the house seemed to absorb their movements, the floorboards creaking in sympathy, shadows stretching longer, air holding the secrets of past generations, while Miss Marple continued to observe, noting that in human behavior, patterns emerge through care, secrecy, and response to discovery, patterns that, when combined with physical evidence, could illuminate long-hidden truths, and she traced how the letters connected to the heirloom, how the hidden passage allowed clandestine movement, how the locked cabinet and previously discovered box fit into a timeline of concealment, access, and intention, forming a comprehensive map of actions and motives, while the heir, absorbed in reading the journal and letters, reacted subtly, frowning at passages, whispering fragments aloud, pausing to reflect, and occasionally glancing toward Miss Marple as if seeking validation or guidance. Each micro-expression catalogued and interpreted by her discerning eye, and she reflected on the emotional weight carried in these reactions, noting the tension between anticipation, fear, respect, and curiosity, understanding that such responses could guide deduction as effectively as any tangible clue, while the manor itself, silent and imposing, seemed to acknowledge the gravity of their exploration. Shadows lengthening, air growing cooler, as if the house held its breath, and Miss Marple, serene and patient, knew that the combination of observation, deduction, and understanding of human nature would reveal the hidden narrative of the manor, the heirloom, and the generations who had acted in secrecy, weaving together the story of concealed actions, family dynamics, and long-held secrets into a coherent tapestry, while outside, the fog of Willowbrook rolled in heavier, muffling distant sounds, heightening the manor's intensity, and as the heir carefully replaced the journal, letters, envelope, and chain into the compartment, Miss Marple noted the faint disturbances left behind. Dust shifted, fingerprints faint but telling, subtle impressions in paper and wood, all evidence that would be crucial to reconstructing the past and understanding human actions, and she reflected that in Silent Manor, as in life, truth is always present in traces, in subtle gestures, in careful observation, and that with patience, insight, and attention to human behavior, every hidden secret, every concealed motive, every silenced story could ultimately be revealed, bringing clarity. Chapter 14. The Whispered Confession. The manor's corridors were cloaked in silence, broken only by the soft echo of footsteps and the occasional creak of old floorboards as Miss Marple and the heir returned from the hidden passage, the heir clutching the small, worn journal and letters to his chest, his eyes wide with both wonder and unease, while the heir seemed charged with anticipation, a quiet intensity that pressed against the walls and furniture, amplifying every sound and movement, and Miss Marple, ever calm, observed every subtle gesture, noting the way his shoulders tensed and relaxed, how his fingers flexed and lingered on the edges of paper, the micro-expressions that betrayed fear, curiosity, reverence, and a hint of guilt, for human behavior under secrecy and revelation often spoke louder than words themselves, and as they moved through the study toward the parlor, the faint scent of wax, dust, and aged paper mingling in the air. Miss Marple's mind traced the connections between the letters, the journal, the heirloom, and the hidden compartments, understanding that each object, each action, and each reaction was a fragment of a larger puzzle, a story of concealment, intent, and emotional history, while the heir, his breathing uneven, paused before a familiar portrait on the wall, his fingers grazing the frame as though seeking reassurance or guidance, and Miss Marple, quietly cataloguing the scene, noticed the slight tilt of the portrait, the faint smudges on the glass, subtle shifts in the dust. Beneath it, each a clue suggesting both frequent attention and a deliberate attempt at concealment, and she reflected on the psychological implications. The heir's attention to this portrait indicated both emotional attachment and perhaps hidden knowledge, and that the manor itself, with its architecture, secret passages, and carefully preserved heirlooms, acted as a silent witness to human behavior, revealing intent and emotion to the patient observer, while outside, Willowbrook remained. Shrouded in mist, the ordinary village unaware of the extraordinary unraveling of secrets atop the hill, and as they reached the parlor, Miss Marple gestured toward the fireplace, suggesting they sit and examine the contents carefully, the heir complying with a mixture of eagerness and trepidation, and as they arranged the letters and journal across the polished surface, Miss Marple noted the order in which he placed them, the reverence with which he handled each, the subtle hesitation before opening envelopes, each micro-movement a silent testimony to the weight of history and the emotional burden of discovery, and she traced the physical and psychological connections. The way fingerprints lingered on paper, the faint impressions left in the leather of the journal, the slight discoloration where hands had touched repeatedly, all evidence of human interaction, secrecy, and attachment. And she began to piece together the narrative suggested by these traces, the family disputes, the whispered promises, the concealed grievances, and the hidden locations of heirlooms, all intertwined in a delicate web of intention, emotion, and concealment, while the heir read aloud fragments of letters, his voice hushed, as though speaking too loudly might awaken long-hidden echoes of the past, and Miss Marple, listening, noted the inflection of his tone, the pauses, the words emphasized or omitted, all revealing subtle emotional truths, while the manor itself seemed to lean in, shadows deepening, candlelight flickering across walls and shelves, highlighting textures, edges, and imperfections that suggested prior disturbances, careful concealments, and deliberate placements, each detail feeding into the intricate map of the house's hidden narrative, and she reflected that understanding human behavior, especially under the weight of secrecy and revelation, was as critical as any physical evidence in uncovering the full truth, for actions, hesitation, attention, and reverence all carried meaning, often overlooked by those less observant, while the heir, encouraged by her calm demeanor, continued to explore the letters, reading aloud passages that hinted at long-forgotten quarrels, concealed inheritance, and clandestine agreements, and Miss Marple, cataloguing micro-expressions and physical cues, noted the momentary flinches, the subtle tightening of lips, the quick glance to the corners of the room, all indications of knowledge, guilt, or unresolved emotion, and she considered how these responses aligned with historical context, past movements, and the manor's architecture, forming a comprehensive understanding of the relationships between people, objects, and spaces, while outside, the fog shifted, muffling distant sounds, heightening the quiet intensity within, and Miss Marple, with her patient and meticulous observation, began to reconstruct the events that had led to the concealment of the heirloom and the letters, understanding that each fragment, every hidden compartment, every carefully folded letter, every hesitant glance, was a piece of a puzzle designed to protect, conceal, or reveal selectively, while the heir, absorbed in reading, uncovered a final passage in the journal, a whispered confession, a statement of past deeds and regrets, the faint tremor in his voice betraying a profound mix of awe, fear, and reverence, and Miss Marple, calm as ever, noted the significance. This confession, though subtle and indirect, illuminated motives, intentions, and relationships previously obscured, linking family disputes, hidden heirlooms, and long-held secrets in a narrative that had quietly unfolded over decades, and as the candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the polished surfaces, Miss Marple traced the chain of cause and effect, human action and emotional consequence, physical evidence and psychological response, understanding that the manor, with its architecture, objects, and history, was both stage and actor in a complex drama of secrecy, legacy, and revelation, and she reflected that the patient, observant mind, attentive to both physical detail and human behavior, was the key to unraveling the full truth, and as the heir placed the journal and letters back into their compartments, a sense of quiet resolution descended, the manor exhaling its collected secrets into the careful awareness of its observer. And Miss Marple, serene, already charting the next investigative steps, recognized that the whispered confession would act as a hinge, turning past mysteries toward clarity, and that with patience, observation, and careful interpretation, the tangled web of concealment, motive, and human emotion within Silent Manor would eventually yield a complete and coherent understanding, restoring order and illumination to a story long shrouded in shadows, hidden compartments, and the careful silences of generations past. Chapter 15. Shadows Behind the Portraits. The manor seemed to hold its breath as evening deepened, the fading light spilling across polished floors and gilded frames, and Miss Marple, seated near the hearth, observed the subtle interplay of shadows and illumination, noting how each painting, each portrait, caught or obscured light in ways that hinted at hidden corners and unexamined spaces, while the heir moved cautiously along the walls, his fingers grazing the edges of frames, pausing at familiar faces whose painted eyes seemed to follow him, and Miss Marple catalogued his micro-expressions, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the hesitation of his step, the subtle tightening of the lips, each revealing emotional response, reverence, or concealed knowledge, while the manor, silent and imposing, seemed to accentuate these small gestures, the creak of floorboards echoing faintly, shadows lengthening across furniture, and the soft hiss of the fireplace underscoring the gravity of their search. And as the heir approached a series of ancestral portraits, Miss Marple noted that the frames were slightly misaligned, some leaning minutely forward, others revealing small gaps between canvas and wall, imperfections that to the untrained eye would appear incidental, but which to an observer of her acuity suggested tampering, subtle adjustments intended to conceal or draw attention to hidden features, while the heir, noticing a particularly ornate frame, lifted it slightly, revealing a shallow recess behind, the faint smell of aged varnish mingling with dust, and Miss Marple catalogued every detail, the disturbed dust on the shelf below, the faint fingerprints along the edges, the tiny scratch where the frame had been moved repeatedly, evidence of past interactions and careful concealment, while outside, the fog rolled over Willowbrook, muffling distant sounds and heightening the silence within, and Miss Marple, with her habitual patience, traced the patterns of human behavior that these signs implied, the deliberate hiding of objects, the emotional investment of those involved, and the potential significance of what might lie behind the portraits, for in her experience, concealment often carries both practical and psychological weight, the act of hiding an object reflecting the importance of its protection and the anxiety surrounding its discovery, and as the heir carefully pried at a hidden latch, the faint click resonated like a whisper through the room, revealing a compartment containing a bundle of letters, yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon, and a small, intricately carved wooden box, their arrangement deliberate, precise, and suggestive of both reverence and secrecy, while Miss Marple noted the heir's careful handling, the slight tremor in his hands, the measured breath, the glances toward her as if seeking silent guidance, all subtle indicators of emotional intensity, and she catalogued each reaction, aware that these micro-behaviors often spoke more truth than words themselves, while the letters, when untied, revealed entries that connected previous clues, cryptic references to inheritance disputes, veiled accusations, and hints of past indiscretions, each penned with meticulous care, yet betraying emotion in the slight smudges, corrections, and careful flourishes, and Miss Marple observed the way the heir absorbed these details, his eyes widening at some passages, narrowing at others, lips pressing together thoughtfully, all signs of processing the weight of knowledge, and she reflected that the manor itself, with its hidden compartments, secret recesses, and carefully positioned objects, functioned as both witness and participant in human affairs, capturing, amplifying, and preserving traces of action, intent, and emotional investment, while the small carved box, when opened, revealed a delicate key, its shape unusual, its weight in the hand suggesting both practicality and ceremonial significance, and Miss Marple traced its potential uses, the locked cabinet in the study, the hidden desk drawer, or perhaps a previously undiscovered chamber within the manor, all potential nodes in the complex network of secrecy, access, and inheritance, while the heir, visibly tense, experimented cautiously with the key, testing its fit against known locks, his hand steadying as he discerned its intended purpose, and Miss Marple catalogued each micro-behavior, the faint quickening of pulse visible in the neck, the subtle flexing of fingers, the hesitancy before movement, all evidence of psychological engagement with both the object and the knowledge it promised, while the manor, silent and watchful, seemed to respond, shadows shifting with the flickering firelight, floorboards creaking under the careful weight of movement, and the air charged with a sense of anticipation, the confluence of human emotion and physical space amplifying the gravity of discovery. And as the key turned in the lock of the previously sealed desk drawer, the Mechanism yielding with a faint click, Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the minute disturbance of dust along the drawer's edges, the subtle misalignment corrected by the turning, and the faint impressions left by prior access, each detail contributing to the full picture of concealment and access over time, while the heir lifted the drawer contents carefully, a stack of documents, a few small personal items, and a sealed envelope marked with an unfamiliar crest, and Miss Marple catalogued the arrangement, the manner of placement, the wear and fingerprints, understanding that each object, each subtle trace, spoke of past events, hidden intentions, and the delicate balance between secrecy and revelation, and she considered the psychological dimension. The careful preservation, the reverent handling, and the hesitancy in exposure all indicated value, fear, and emotional weight, while the heir, absorbed in the documents, whispered passages aloud, his voice carrying the weight of astonishment, recognition, and the slow comprehension of hidden truths, and Miss Marple, calm and observant, connected these fragments with the previously uncovered letters, journal entries, hidden compartments, and the manor's architecture, tracing the network of cause, consequence, and intent, aware that human behavior, carefully observed, revealed both motive and opportunity, and that the confluence of evidence, physical and psychological, would ultimately illuminate the full narrative of Silent Manor, the heirloom, and the generations who had lived and acted in secrecy, while outside, the night deepened, Willowbrook muffled under fog and darkness, and inside, the manor seemed to pulse with the weight of revealed secrets, the quiet triumph of observation, deduction, and patient attention to detail, each subtle movement, shadow, and hesitation catalogued, until finally the heir, looking toward Miss Marple, placed the documents carefully back into the drawer, his expression a mixture of relief, reverence, and dawning comprehension, and Miss Marple, serene as always, reflected that the manor, in its silent witness of decades, had now spoken its truths, and that each trace, micro-behavior, and carefully concealed object had led to this moment of revelation. While the candlelight flickered, shadows danced, and the weight of history settled into a quiet clarity, for the patient, observant mind can reconstruct past secrets, decode hidden motives, and illuminate even the most carefully guarded mysteries, and with the manor's secrets partially unveiled, Miss Marple knew the path toward the full resolution of the silent. Chapter 16. Secrets in the Servants' Quarters. The manor seemed to exhale as the heir led Miss Marple toward the servants' quarters, a part of the house often overlooked, dimly lit by narrow windows and the occasional flicker of a wall sconce, the scent of wax, polish, and old wood mingling with the faint trace of herbs and dust, while Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and patient, catalogued every detail, every shadow and subtle disturbance, noting the way the floorboards creaked more under certain steps, the slight dents and marks in the wood, the worn edges of the doors, all silent witnesses to decades of hidden activity and clandestine movement, and the heir, slightly hesitant, brushed his fingers along the railing as though seeking reassurance, while the walls, adorned with faded photographs and utilitarian hooks for tools and garments, seemed to amplify the tension of anticipation, each object, each shadow, each whisper of sound carrying potential significance, and Miss Marple observed his movements, noting the tightening of shoulders, the quickening of pulse visible even in the pale light, the subtle tremor in hands hovering over drawers and cabinets, micro-expressions revealing apprehension, curiosity, and perhaps unspoken memories, while the manor, silent and patient, seemed to watch as well, its structure holding the weight of secrets that spanned generations, and as they entered the narrow hallway between rooms, Miss Marple noticed that the dust on the floors was disturbed in a pattern suggesting recent passage, footprints faint but telling, and scuff marks near a small, unassuming door hinted at repeated use, while the heir, sensing her attention, paused, eyes narrowing thoughtfully, lips pressed together as he traced the edges of the door with careful fingertips, testing for hidden latches or irregularities, and Miss Marple catalogued every nuance, the slight misalignment of the hinges, the faint scratch on the frame, the way shadows fell to conceal the smallest gap, all pointing to something deliberately hidden, carefully maintained over time, and she reflected that in her experience, objects and spaces long tended by human hands carried psychological as well as physical traces, revealing intention, fear, reverence, and the subtle prioritization of secrecy, while outside, Willowbrook lay quiet under the night sky, fog creeping along hedgerows, muffling distant sounds, heightening the stillness within the manor, and Miss Marple, patient and unhurried, considered the interplay of environment, architecture, and human behavior, recognizing that the servants' quarters, though often overlooked, might hold the key to understanding past concealments, hidden access, and long-buried knowledge, and as the heir gently opened a small cabinet, the hinges protesting faintly, Miss Marple observed the contents carefully, a collection of old keys, a bundle of neatly folded linens, a few personal trinkets, and tucked behind a row of bottles, a small, unmarked envelope, yellowed with age, and she noted the arrangement, the subtle signs of handling, the slight creases and smudges, all evidence of attention, concealment, and potential importance, while the heir, his curiosity piqued, lifted the envelope carefully, turning it over in his hands, noting the faint impressions of writing beneath the paper, a wax seal faintly visible at the flap, and Miss Marple, ever observant, catalogued his reactions. The slight pause before he broke the seal, the quickened breath, the flicker of eyes scanning the contents, all subtle cues to the emotional weight of discovery, while the manor itself seemed to hold its breath, shadows stretching longer as candlelight flickered across worn floorboards and faded wallpaper, amplifying tension. And as the heir carefully unfolded the paper, Miss Marple noticed the handwriting, precise yet tentative, the words themselves cryptic but suggesting past communications, unspoken agreements, and concealed actions, the phrasing hinting at both anxiety and determination, and she considered the implications for the larger puzzle of the Silent Manor heirloom, the connections between the servants, the family, and the hidden objects that had passed through many hands over time, while the heir read aloud, whispering the contents as if the manor itself required discretion, and Miss Marple catalogued the vocal inflections, pauses, and subtle hesitations, noting how each reflected understanding, surprise, or recognition, each a psychological footprint complementing the physical clues, while outside, the fog thickened, muffling the distant village, heightening the intimacy and intensity of discovery within. And as the contents of the envelope revealed a small map of hidden compartments, annotations in careful handwriting, and references to long-forgotten keys and passages, Miss Marple traced the interconnections, the layering of concealment, the deliberate complexity intended to protect heirlooms and information, while the heir, eyes wide with comprehension and awe, traced the lines of the map, connecting dots in the house that had previously gone unnoticed, each realization deepening the understanding of past actions, hidden motives, and the careful orchestration of secrecy over generations. And Miss Marple observed his reactions closely, noting the excitement tempered with apprehension, the quiet reverence, the subtle tension in posture and facial expression, all evidence of human engagement with both history and discovery, while the manor, silent witness to decades of secrets, seemed to pulse with recognition, each creak of floorboard, each flicker of candlelight, each shifting shadow contributing to the weight of accumulated knowledge. And as they examined the map more closely, Miss Marple began to deduce patterns, connections between hidden passages, concealed compartments, and the objects they had already uncovered, linking together the family, the servants, and the manor itself in a network of action, intention, and consequence, while the heir, overwhelmed yet focused, traced a route through the quarters, revealing previously overlooked alcoves, spaces behind cupboards, and subtle indentations in walls, all confirming the map's indications. And Miss Marple, ever patient and observant, noted that human behavior, careful, repetitive, deliberate, had left evidence everywhere, and that by following these traces, one could reconstruct the hidden actions, motivations, and secrets of generations, while the heir, emboldened by understanding, carefully examined a small trapdoor beneath a low cabinet, its edges worn, hinges rusted but functional, and with her quiet guidance, Miss Marple watched as he gently lifted it to reveal a narrow, dimly lit passage descending below the servants' quarters, the air cool and tinged with the scent of earth and wood, and she noted the way his posture shifted, balance cautious, movements deliberate, each subtle reaction catalogued for insight into his emotional state, while the manor, in turn, seemed to embrace the unfolding drama, shadows stretching and flickering across walls, floors, and ceiling, amplifying the tension and the significance of discovery. And as they descended, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate dance of human intention, concealment, and discovery, understanding that the combination of physical evidence, architecture, and psychological observation would ultimately reveal the full truth of the Silent Manor heirloom, each detail, no matter how minor, contributing to the complete story of secrecy, trust, and revelation. And with the passage now open before them. Chapter 17. The Hidden Corridor. The discovery of the map had stirred a quiet excitement that moved through the manor like a current, and as Miss Marple followed the heir down the narrow passage beneath the servants' quarters, the air grew cooler, damp with the scent of earth and old wood, shadows stretching along the low beams and uneven stone floor, while the flicker of candlelight cast shifting patterns across the walls, illuminating cracks, cobwebs, and faint scratches that seemed to hint at years of secret movement. And Miss Marple observed every subtle detail, the slight warping of the wooden supports, the faint traces of dust disturbed in a deliberate pattern, and the small indentations along the floor that suggested repeated passage, all indicators of a hidden corridor long used for purposes now lost to time, while the heir, his steps careful and deliberate, paused at intervals, fingers grazing the walls as though seeking tactile confirmation. His eyes darting to the faint glimmers of light reflected from unseen corners, and Miss Marple, cataloguing each micro-behavior, noted the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his breath quickened at moments of uncertainty, the subtle compression of lips, all telling of both apprehension and anticipation, while the manor seemed to watch with silent patience, every creak, draft, and echo amplifying the tension. And she reflected on the significance of human interaction with hidden spaces, the repeated use of a corridor, the careful concealment of entrances, and the reverent handling of objects left behind all spoke to priorities, fear, and intentional secrecy, while outside, Willowbrook remained shrouded in mist, distant sounds muffled, creating an atmosphere that heightened the intimacy and intensity of their exploration, and as they approached a small, unassuming door at the end of the corridor, Miss Marple noticed subtle irregularities in its construction. A slightly larger gap along one edge, a hinge worn in a pattern inconsistent with the others, and faint scratches near the handle, all suggesting repeated, careful use, while the heir, noticing these cues, reached for the knob, hesitated, and then gently turned it, releasing a soft click that echoed faintly in the narrow passage, revealing a previously hidden chamber, dimly lit by the faint glow of a single dusty window, the floor scattered with remnants of old furniture, cobwebs, and small objects that hinted at prior concealment, and Miss Marple, observing the spatial arrangement, noted the deliberate placement of each item, a chair tipped slightly forward, a cabinet ajar, and a low chest with faint impressions suggesting frequent handling, all markers of significance, while the heir, stepping inside with caution, traced his fingers along the surfaces, uncovering small indentations, subtle scratches, and faded inscriptions that hinted at ownership, access, and careful preservation, and Miss Marple, cataloguing each physical clue alongside the heir's micro-reactions, tension in his posture, quickened breathing, and narrowing of the eyes, recognized the psychological implications, understanding that the combination of spatial arrangement, human behavior, and emotional investment formed a coherent map of past intent and activity, while the chamber itself seemed to exhale the weight of history, its walls, ceiling, and floor carrying the faint resonance of footsteps long ago, objects long hidden, and secrets carefully maintained, and as the heir lifted a small, dust-covered chest, Miss Marple noticed the precise way his hands flexed over the edges, the subtle hesitation before opening, and the reverent care applied to the old lock, which yielded with a soft click, revealing inside a collection of documents, personal effects, and an envelope sealed with wax, the seal imprinted with an unfamiliar crest, while Miss Marple catalogued each item's positioning, fingerprints, and wear, interpreting the evidence of repeated access and emotional investment, and the heir, absorbed, began reading aloud, his voice low, reverent, carrying a mixture of shock, understanding, and the dawning recognition of past events, while Miss Marple, calm and patient, traced the implications of each sentence, the hidden relationships, and the careful layering of concealment, noting how past generations had carefully orchestrated secrecy to protect heirlooms, convey messages, and preserve power within the manor, and as the envelope revealed a series of instructions for locating further hidden items, Miss Marple connected the sequence to previous discoveries, the map from the servants' quarters, the letters, the journal, and the key found in the study, forming a network of clues that spanned rooms, floors, and generations, while the heir, eyes wide with comprehension, traced the steps physically, comparing with the map, each realization bringing together previously disconnected fragments, and Miss Marple observed his every reaction, the subtle smile, the deepening furrow of concentration, the occasional pause for reflection, all telling of a mind processing discovery and revelation, while the manor, silent witness to decades of human behavior, seemed to pulse with the weight of history, shadows flickering, floorboards creaking under careful steps, and the air carrying the faint scent of old paper, wax, and dust, amplifying the psychological tension, and Miss Marple, thinking several steps ahead, considered how the information gathered here could reveal the identities of those who had acted in secrecy, the reasons for concealment, and the pattern of inheritance, trust, and betrayal, and as the heir followed instructions from the envelope to uncover a false panel behind the wall, Miss Marple observed the subtle relief and trepidation in his movements, the careful rotation of hands along the edges, and the precision required to avoid disturbing hidden items, while the panel, when removed, revealed a small, intricately carved box containing an heirloom of exquisite workmanship, its surface engraved with initials and a family crest, the weight in the heir's hands confirming its authenticity and historical importance, and Miss Marple, cataloguing every micro-behavior, subtle inflection in voice, and gesture, reflected on the significance of cumulative evidence, understanding that the combination of physical traces, human response, and spatial awareness allowed a reconstruction of both the actions and intentions of past actors, while the manor itself, every corner, corridor, and chamber now speaking through traces, objects, and atmosphere, guided them toward a comprehensive understanding of the Silent Manor heirloom, each object and hidden compartment linking past to present, secrecy to revelation, and human behavior to consequence, and as the heir held the heirloom aloft, a sense of quiet triumph settled over the chamber, the manor exhaling decades of concealed secrets into the patient awareness of its observers, and Miss Marple, serene, recording every detail in her mind, knew that while more discoveries remained to be made, the interconnected web of hidden passages, objects, and letters had now provided a coherent framework, a foundation upon which the ultimate resolution of the Silent Manor heirloom mystery could be constructed, each subtle shadow, creak of floorboard, and gesture observed serving as a crucial piece of the intricate puzzle of secrecy, intention, and revelation. Chapter 18. The Forgotten Attic. The air in the manor seemed heavier as Miss Marple and the heir ascended the narrow staircase toward the attic, each step creaking beneath their weight, the shadows stretching long and narrow along the walls, the scent of aged wood, dust, and faint mildew hinting at decades of neglect, while the flicker of candlelight danced across the banisters, illuminating small details, a faded sketch pinned to the wall, a scuff mark where boxes had been dragged, a loose floorboard slightly lifted from repeated footsteps, and Miss Marple catalogued everything, the precise positioning, the wear patterns, and the faint fingerprints, each a subtle marker of human interaction with the space, while the heir, cautious yet determined, traced the edges of old trunks and crates, noting the carefully written labels in fading ink, the delicate paper that suggested care and reverence, and the slight tremor in his hands betraying the emotional weight of discovery, while Miss Marple observed his posture, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the furrow of concentration, and the quickening of breath, understanding that even small gestures could reveal the intensity of human engagement with secrecy, and the attic itself, long forgotten by casual visitors, seemed to hum with a silent memory, the accumulated years of storage, concealment, and careful preservation speaking through each shadow, crack, and faded object, while outside, Willowbrook lay in silence beneath a blanket of fog, muffling distant sounds and amplifying the stillness and tension within the manor, and as they carefully opened a large, dust-covered trunk, Miss Marple noted the careful layering of contents, old letters bundled with string, faded photographs, worn garments, and a small, unassuming wooden box whose surface bore scratches that suggested both age and frequent handling, while the heir, eyes wide with curiosity, gently lifted the box, the faint creak of hinges echoing through the attic, revealing a collection of documents, a tiny diary bound in leather, and a sealed envelope marked with a delicate crest, and Miss Marple catalogued each detail. The careful arrangement, the subtle fingerprints, the smudges on the leather cover, all silent markers of human attention, care, and secrecy, while the heir opened the diary slowly, his voice soft as he read aloud passages that hinted at hidden alliances, family tensions, and long-forgotten promises, the careful phrasing revealing both emotional vulnerability and deliberate concealment, and Miss Marple, noting the micro-expressions, the narrowing of eyes, the slight parting of lips, the tension in shoulders, understood the heir's reactions as a reflection of both recognition and the weight of inherited knowledge, while the manor itself seemed to pulse with the gravity of revelation, shadows stretching across the slanted ceiling, floorboards creaking faintly under the movement of air and footsteps, the atmosphere charged with anticipation, and as the envelope was opened, Miss Marple observed the faint indentation of writing beneath the wax seal, the careful folds and aging of the paper, each detail confirming the importance of the contents and the deliberate care of previous generations, while the letters inside revealed instructions for unlocking further secrets, references to previously hidden compartments, and cryptic notations that suggested yet another layer of concealment, and Miss Marple traced these connections to the map from the servants' quarters, the key found in the study, and the hidden corridor, forming a comprehensive web of physical evidence, human behavior, and psychological cues, while the heir, absorbed, followed each instruction with a mixture of awe and careful deliberation, handling objects reverently, pausing frequently to compare details, and occasionally glancing at Miss Marple for reassurance, whose calm, observant gaze catalogued each subtle gesture, noting the consistency of behavior, the small movements, and the quiet engagement with the unfolding narrative, while the attic, a repository of decades of human secrecy and careful concealment, seemed to acknowledge the patient, methodical investigation, shadows flickering over worn surfaces, dust particles glinting in the candlelight, and faint echoes amplifying the tension of discovery, And as the heir located a previously overlooked panel behind a stack of crates, Miss Marple observed the subtle changes in posture, the careful rotation of hands along edges, the hesitation before manipulation, all indicating awareness of potential significance and the emotional weight of uncovering history. And when the panel was removed, revealing a small recess containing an intricately carved box with a hidden latch, the heir's careful handling, slow exhalation, and reverent touch emphasized both discovery and respect. While Miss Marple catalogued the traces of past engagement, faint scratches, fingerprints, and worn edges, recognizing the deliberate attention, concealment, and preservation by previous generations, and as the box was opened, it contained a selection of heirlooms, a delicate necklace, a set of miniature portraits, and several folded letters in a foreign hand, while the heir, reading each carefully, traced connections to the diary, map, and envelope, creating a timeline and network of secrecy, inheritance, and human behavior that Miss Marple noted meticulously, understanding how physical evidence, past concealments, and subtle reactions combined to reveal motive, opportunity, and the careful orchestration of secrecy, while outside, the night deepened, fog rolling over Willowbrook, the village muffled in silence, and inside, the manor seemed alive with the weight of revelation, shadows flickering, floorboards creaking faintly, air tinged with dust, wax, and the faint musk of aged wood, amplifying both tension and significance, and Miss Marple, serene and focused, understood that the final steps of discovery, connecting all the clues, documents, and hidden objects, would lead to a complete understanding of the Silent Manor heirloom, each subtle observation, gesture, and psychological cue providing the bridge between generations, secrecy, and revelation, while the heir, reverent and careful, replaced each item in its respective container, noting the sequence, alignment, and care necessary to preserve history, and Miss Marple, patiently observing, prepared to guide the next stage of discovery, knowing that each uncovered secret brought them closer to understanding the full story, the intricate web of human behavior, and the careful orchestration of concealment and revelation that defined Silent Manor. Chapter 19. The Clock Tower Discovery. As the first light of dawn crept through the narrow windows of Silent Manor, casting long, muted beams across the aged floorboards, Miss Marple and the heir found themselves at the base of the grand clock tower, its face looming above them like a silent witness to generations of secrets, and as they ascended the spiral staircase, the air grew cooler, tinged with a faint scent of oil and metal, while the echo of their footsteps resonated through the hollow shaft, each sound amplified in the vertical expanse, and Miss Marple, ever observant, catalogued every subtle detail, the worn edges of the stone steps, the fine scratches along the handrail, and the faint smudges on the walls, all evidence of long-forgotten journeys up and down the tower, while the heir, cautious and deliberate, traced his fingers along the metal supports, noting the subtle vibrations, the alignment of gears visible through narrow openings, and the small maintenance hatches, each likely a key to understanding both mechanism and concealment, and Miss Marple's mind, weaving together architectural evidence, human behavior, and psychological cues, recognized the potential significance of each feature, for in her experience, even utilitarian structures often held secrets, either hidden objects, clandestine passages, or markers of past activity, while outside, Willowbrook lay in the misty morning, the village silent except for the occasional crowing of a distant rooster, the fog curling around hedgerows and rooftops, emphasizing the isolation and intimacy of the manor's hidden spaces, and as they reached the landing near the clock's main mechanism, Miss Marple observed the interplay of shadows cast by rotating gears, the fine layers of dust disturbed in particular patterns, and the subtle traces of fingerprints on metal and wood, evidence that the space had been used, perhaps frequently, but with care and discretion, while the heir, peering through the intricate workings, noticed a faint engraving along the brass gear housing, barely visible, its script small and deliberate, and Miss Marple, noting the micro-expression of surprise and recognition on his face, catalogued the emotional resonance, the slight widening of eyes, the parting of lips, and the gentle intake of breath, all signaling the significance of the discovery, and she considered how past custodians had deliberately left clues for those observant enough to interpret them, layering physical evidence with psychological subtlety, while the tower, silent and patient, seemed to amplify the tension, shadows flickering across faces and hands, dust motes catching the light in slow, hypnotic arcs, and each movement of the air traced a story of interaction with the space over decades, carefully orchestrated to maintain secrecy, yet hinting at revelation for the diligent observer, and as he manipulated a small hidden lever, previously overlooked and concealed within the framework of the clock, a portion of the tower wall silently shifted, revealing a narrow recess containing a worn, leather-bound ledger and a sealed envelope marked with the family crest, while Miss Marple, cataloging every detail, noted the alignment, the subtle wear from repeated handling, the faint impressions of writing beneath the wax, and the placement of the objects, all deliberately chosen to protect secrets while signaling importance to those perceptive enough to see. And as the heir carefully removed the contents, the faint metallic smell of the gears mixed with the aged aroma of paper and binding, a sensory cue of history, concealment, and deliberate care, while Miss Marple observed his actions, noting the precision of his touch, the slight hesitation before opening the envelope, and the reverent unfolding of the ledger, all micro-behaviors indicative of emotional investment, anticipation, and recognition. And the documents inside revealed names, dates, and instructions detailing hidden compartments, the transfer of heirlooms, and subtle annotations suggesting prior knowledge of events yet unknown to current inhabitants, while Miss Marple, quietly analyzing the information, traced connections between the ledger, the attic discoveries, the servants' quarters, and the hidden corridor, forming a network of interrelated evidence, secrets, and human intentions spanning generations, while the heir absorbed, compared annotations with previously discovered maps and letters, aligning them physically and mentally, each cross-reference confirming patterns, revealing motives, and exposing long-concealed actions, and Miss Marple, patient and observant, noted the subtle interplay between historical documentation, human emotion, and architectural concealment, understanding that the careful orchestration of secrecy often relied as much on psychology as on physical barriers, while outside, the fog began to lift, softening the morning light, but inside the tower, shadows, dust, and the faint creak of gears enhanced the psychological tension, each observation, sound, and micro-expression contributing to the slowly unfolding revelation, and as the heir, guided by the ledger, found a hidden compartment behind one of the clock faces, Miss Marple observed the precise rotations, pressure applied, and gentle manipulations required to access it, while the compartment revealed a set of delicate objects, a small, gilded key, a collection of miniature paintings, and a folded letter with cryptic instructions, each item meticulously preserved, hinting at careful, intentional concealment, and as the heir carefully examined each piece, Miss Marple noted the emotional response, slight widening of eyes, a gentle gasp, fingers trembling just enough to betray excitement, all revealing the personal and historical significance of the items, while she catalogued the evidence, linking it to prior discoveries, understanding that the manor's secrets were layered with both material and psychological complexity, designed to test the perception, patience, and insight of those who sought the truth. And as they descended the spiral staircase with the newly discovered heirlooms, Miss Marple reflected on the interplay of human behavior, architecture, and secrecy, recognizing that each space, object, and gesture formed a piece of the intricate puzzle of the Silent Manor heirloom, each layer providing insight into intention, trust, and legacy, while the heir, carefully holding the delicate items, moved with reverence, mindful of the weight of history and the significance of the discoveries, and Miss Marple, calm, patient, and meticulous, prepared to guide the final stages of investigation, confident that the careful observation of both physical and psychological clues would ultimately illuminate the complete truth, connecting hidden compartments, family secrets, and the deliberate orchestration of concealment across generations, while the manor itself, silent and imposing, seemed to acknowledge the resolution approaching, shadows flickering across walls and floorboards, dust motes dancing in candlelight, and the weight of decades of secrecy slowly yielding to patient observation, careful deduction, and understanding of human nature, culminating in the imminent revelation of the complete story of the Silent Manor heirloom. Chapter 20. The Final Revelation. The manor seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple and the heir gathered the accumulated documents, heirlooms, and letters from the hidden compartments, the air thick with anticipation and the faint musk of aged paper, wax, and wood, while sunlight, filtered through heavy curtains, fell in muted shafts across the polished floors, illuminating the subtle scratches, dents, and patterns left by decades of human interaction, and Miss Marple, serene and composed, surveyed the collection of evidence, cataloging in her mind the intricate network of human behavior, deliberate concealment, and subtle psychological cues that had guided generations, noting the patterns of fingerprints, wear, placement, and sequence, each a deliberate marker meant to preserve secrets while simultaneously guiding those perceptive enough toward revelation, while the heir, both awed and nervous, handled each item with reverence, eyes scanning every detail, tracing inscriptions, comparing letters, and mentally mapping the relationships between objects, people, and events, and Miss Marple, observing the micro-expressions, slight widening of eyes, subtle tightening of lips, shifts in posture, interpreted emotional significance, recognition, and comprehension, understanding that the heir's reactions themselves were pieces of the puzzle, reflecting both inherited knowledge and the psychological weight of revelation, while the manor, silent and imposing, seemed to whisper in echoes of creaking floorboards. Shifting shadows and faint drafts through gaps in the woodwork, the very atmosphere steeped in the accumulated tension, secrets, and deliberate concealments of centuries, and as Miss Marple began arranging the evidence on the long oak table in the drawing-room, she noted the deliberate placement of objects. Letters aligned with corresponding heirlooms, maps correlating with hidden passages, diaries linked to annotations in ledgers, each detail creating a lattice of connections, while the heir, following her gentle guidance, began to see the coherence of past actions, the web of human intentions, and the careful orchestration of secrecy that had persisted for generations, and Miss Marple, silently noting patterns in handwriting, wear, placement, and even emotional responses, began the process of unraveling the final thread of the Silent Manor heirloom, connecting motivations, concealed relationships, and the deliberate layering of clues that spanned generations, while outside, Willowbrook's morning fog lifted slowly, revealing the quiet village in gentle light, the distant sounds of roosters and early market activity muffled by distance, emphasizing the intimate, enclosed world of the manor and its secrets, and as she carefully laid out the letters revealing past agreements, wills, and instructions for the distribution of heirlooms, Miss Marple traced each connection with precision, noting how each item, person, and concealed space fit into a coherent narrative, the layers of secrecy reflecting both prudence and the natural human desire to protect reputation, property, and legacy, while the heir, leaning forward with an intensity that reflected both curiosity and emotional investment, compared each document against the ledger, the diary, and the hidden compartments discovered in the corridor, attic, and clock tower, forming a mental map that aligned perfectly with the physical evidence, and Miss Marple, calm and precise, guided him with subtle questions, gentle prompts, and careful observations, allowing him to draw the final conclusions while ensuring the narrative remained coherent, accurate, and fully grounded in the evidence, while the manor itself seemed to approve the meticulous uncovering of secrets, shadows flickering with the shifting light, dust dancing in fine beams, and the faint creaks of floorboards echoing like whispers of long-forgotten voices, and as they reached the letters detailing the ultimate disposition of the heirlooms, Miss Marple drew attention to subtle annotations, marginal notes, faint pencil marks, and variations in ink, each signifying careful attention, deliberate concealment, and intended revelation for those with perceptive eyes, while the heir, eyes wide, traced the final steps, connecting hidden compartments to documented instructions, aligning each artifact with its intended recipient, and understanding the careful orchestration that had guided multiple generations, and Miss Marple, noting the culmination of physical and psychological evidence, reflected on the deliberate balance between secrecy and guidance, recognizing that the careful sequencing of clues, artifacts, and micro-behaviors had ensured that only the perceptive and patient would fully understand the Silent Manor heirloom, while outside, sunlight brightened the village, birds called in the distance, and yet inside, the manor held a sacred intensity, the revelation imminent, as Miss Marple, her calm gaze sweeping over every item, every mark, and every expression, prepared to deliver the final explanation, tying together decades of secrecy, carefully preserved heirlooms, hidden corridors, and the psychological subtleties of human behavior, and as the heir, holding the delicate objects, absorbed in both comprehension and awe, turned to her with anticipation, Miss Marple began to speak, explaining how each subtle trace, gesture, placement, and document connected, how the hidden passages, the clock tower, and the attic had all been deliberately orchestrated, how the letters and diaries had preserved intentions, and how the manor itself had acted as a silent witness, guiding perceptive eyes to revelation, and as her explanation unfolded, the heir's expression shifted, first shock, then understanding, then quiet admiration, as decades of carefully layered secrecy, human behavior, and physical evidence converged into a coherent, astonishing truth, while Miss Marple, serene, observed, knowing that the culmination of observation, patience, and human understanding had illuminated the complete story, every hidden compartment, subtle annotation, and behavioral cue now fully explained, leaving both heir and observer with a profound comprehension of the Silent Manor heirloom, the delicate balance of secrecy and revelation, and the quiet intelligence that had preserved history and guided them to the final revelation, as the manor exhaled its long-held secrets into patient, perceptive, and understanding hands, ensuring that generations of concealment, protection, and intention had finally yielded to clarity, insight, and enduring legacy, while the sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted every object, every shadow, and every carefully orchestrated detail, confirming that the truth of the Silent Manor heirloom had at last been revealed, with Miss Marple's quiet genius guiding the way.